Part 2. Tokyo to Dunquin. Chapter 11. First Class in the First World. At Narita Airport, we perplexed customs. Here we were, American citizens, with German motorcycles flying into Tokyo from Beijing. It was a little too much for them. Using less sign language and more English, we made our needs known, but the customs officers hadn't had much experience with carnets. These were bonds we'd bought from an English insurance company that guaranteed we wouldn't sell our bikes within the countries through which we passed. Fortunately, we'd prepared for this eventuality back in London by obtaining the name of an official at the Japanese Automobile Association who would be familiar with them. The customs official called him and was filled in. What a difference from China, where most requests were met by "没有," not have, which could mean not available today, not available for foreigners, maybe later, not possible because I'm on my break, or I don't know anything about it, so I'm not taking any chances. The Japanese met every request, whether they could carry it out or not, with a vigorous "hai," yes. At this point, it was 5 o'clock in the evening. Any minute now, I was certain the customs officers were going to tell us they were closing and that tomorrow was a holiday, come back Tuesday. These civil servants, however, stuck with the job of processing us through till they finished, even though it took an hour or so of overtime. They presented us with a bill for the extra time, but I was delighted to pay and finish the hassle. If only border officials and bureaucrats in other parts of the world had the same can-do attitude. This is one reason the Japanese are rich. Grinning from ear to ear like fools, Tabitha and I drove to the Imperial Hotel in downtown Tokyo, across from the Imperial Palace. We pulled right up to the lobby, motorcycles muddy, spare tires hanging off our rear ends, fairings busted, and nobody batted an eye. Once we were in the sumptuous room, we were beside ourselves with disbelief and joy. On the road, we often had been immersed in practical problems. How to get across the next border, what the road ahead was like, where to stay, where would be the gas in the next town, could we buy tires, the logistics of it all. Although traveling through exotic locales had often made us gape with astonishment, we hadn't awoken every single day and thrilled to our new location. But now that we had an interlude in a first-class hotel room in a first-world country, we sank back and realized what we had just done. My God, I said. We drove through the Chinese desert. All of China, Tabitha said with a big smile, pleased with herself. All the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. According to the folks at the Guinness Book of Records, no one before had ever done it by land. You're the first woman to do it, I said, which made us both beam with pride. I was hoping the joy of accomplishment and the thrill of the exotic would rekindle her enthusiasm for the rest of the trip, because she had been making rumblings over the past few days of not being sure she wanted to go farther, that maybe she'd fly back to New York from Tokyo. Her bike was still giving her trouble, and she was weary of the road. But I didn't say anything, figuring it best for her to rest a few days before we discussed it. We both were amazed by the contrast of Japan, not just to China, but to nearly every other place in the world. How beautiful the roads were, and what good repair everything was, how clean the parks and buildings were. It wasn't like driving into New York, Rome, or London, which in areas made you think you were in the third world. Japan was run like a very tight ship under the eye of a hard-boiled skipper. We took our bikes to the local BMW dealer, where we told them to throw away our old tires and put on new ones. They would rebuild my carburetor and overhaul Tabitha's engine. Back in January of 1990, I had predicted in Barron's that the Japanese stock market would fall by at least 50%. A local financial journalist caught up with me in Japan and wanted to know what I thought about the market now that it was down from near 40,000 to 29,000. Was this the bottom? Should investors be piling in? A day or so before, I had noticed that the front page of a local newspaper printed an index of the average price of membership in Tokyo golf clubs, the way back in the States newspapers published the Dow Jones Stock Index. It had hit $1 million. $1 million to belong to a golf club. This sounded like a speculative bubble to me, a financial feeding frenzy without intrinsic value, and the top of one at that. When you see a value as out of whack as this, stand back and ask yourself if something is wrong. Stop and think about it. Perhaps everybody around you is losing his head. In 1929, you would have seen the same speculative hyperactivity in stocks. In the real world, golf memberships can't be worth $1 million. I said the stock and real estate market had a lot further down to go, as it was clear nobody in the market was suffering any pain from this drop. In addition to sky-high prices for golf memberships, Japan's real estate prices were still at cloud-like levels. The ground on which the emperor's palace stood was said to be worth more than the entire state of Florida. Moreover, I knew the Bank of Japan was tightening the money supply. It had announced that it wanted to get rid of the speculative bubble. When the Japanese central bank says something, it's like the German Bundesbank. It means it. It doesn't play around. But the guys in the Japanese market had never known anything but a bull market. They didn't know things could change. All they knew about stocks was that they went up. Well, the real world didn't work that way, but they weren't going to listen to me. It all reminded me of how they'd gotten out on this limb in the first place. The Japanese have the largest foreign currency reserves in the world, largely because they have had extremely large balance of trade surpluses over many past years. After the war, the way to get rich in many countries, Japan and Germany especially, was to get foreign, hard currency, such as dollars, any currency that didn't lose its value, just the way it is today in Russia or China. The more dollars, marks, or yen you have in those places, the better off you are in those economies. So after the Second World War, the Japanese said, how do you get hard currency? You export. You give the folks with hard currency something they want, and they'll give some of it to you. They learned, taught themselves, that what foreigners want is quality. They pushed their workers to make quality goods because they were desperate for foreign currency. Their country was devastated. They couldn't buy anything with the local currency because it was basically worthless, or perceived as worthless outside their country because they didn't have any foreign currency reserves. What happened was the same thing that happens any time an energetic people get an idea where the gold mine is. In California, let's rush out there. It can be a real gold mine, or a Wall Street boom, or oil wells in Texas, or tourism in Xi'an, or a pile of hard currency. But once industrious people see where it is, they'll jump for it. The Japanese export boom was born from that. It wasn't as though some evil Japanese minister said, all right, guys, let's start exporting and put the Americans out of business, re-fight World War II. People say the Japanese copied everybody else. No, they just saw what the customers were buying. They saw that everybody wanted a TV, and they faced up to the hard truth that they had to make a cheaper, better TV, or they wouldn't be able to sell the ones they made. The results? Between 1957, when their pre-war economic benchmarks were regained, and 1970, their economy grew 10% annually, several times faster than ours. By 1980, their automobile production surpassed ours, and by 1986, they were supplying nearly a quarter of our imports. What a difference between the Japanese attitude and that of the American government. We say, let's let the dollar depreciate and devalue. We'll be the low-cost producers and we'll sell more because our prices will be lower. Except for short periods, that policy has never, ever worked in the history of the world. You can sell only so far on price. And why not? Say Chevrolet and Toyota sell more or less identical cars for $10,000. If the United States devalues the dollar by 30%, the Chevrolet will still sell for $10,000, but the Toyota will now go for $13,000. At first blush, this looks good. Finally, American automotive workers' jobs will be protected. How can it hurt us if we make it difficult for the Japanese to sell in our market? However, in the real world, what happens is that under the umbrella of the devalued currency, Chevrolet, Ford, and Plymouth will raise their price to, say, $11,500, as now it's easy to underprice the foreign competition. Well, some say it's worth it if we keep our people employed, if we make America first. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Because the dry cleaner on the corner has paid 15% more for his Chevrolet, as has every one of his suppliers, he must raise his prices to reflect the increase. He and his suppliers must also collectively pay 30% more for all the things we Americans import, be they palladium, titanium, cobalt, chrome, tin, coffee, cocoa. The list is endless. Add these to the domestic increases brought about by devaluation, and its seemingly no-cost benefits disappear in a year or so. In addition, when you sell on price, you don't innovate and make your products better. They get shoddier in comparison with your competition's. You become fat and lazy and sloppy. Now inflation starts. The Chevrolet creeps up in price till it sells at $13,000 or even $14,000. Toyotas sell for less, and Chevrolet loses more market share. As this scenario is repeated, a powerful noose tightens around the country's financial jugular that it only rarely escapes. Your costs again catch up with you, and you have to devalue again. Devaluation creates a never-ending vicious circle. If it worked, Italy would not have a stagnant economy, political and economic corruption, and constant inflation. Zaire, with an economy that is one of the world's basket cases, would be the world's most efficient producer. After all, on a purchasing power basis, the Zaire currency is wildly underpriced because nobody wants it. So, while our government today keeps saying, let's sell on price, no other country in the world will now even claim that devaluation is a good long-term strategy. The Brits excuse their devaluations by saying they need to buy some time, but they've been buying time now for decades. 30 years ago, the British pound sterling would buy 11 German marks. Today, it will buy less than 2.5. If the British don't change this, in 30 more years the pound will be that much less valuable. Governments have only 3 choices in their fiscal management. Be disciplined by spending no more than they take in from taxes, borrow to cover their deficits, or print new money. World markets made Zaire pay by depreciating its currency and refusing to lend it any more money, and so its currency has become worthless. The market will do the same to the United States if we don't shape up, if we keep running a budget deficit and borrowing our heads off. The longer we put off correcting the financial mess the federal government has produced, the worse the pain will be. Right now, we are the largest debtor nation in the world by a factor of 7 times. Yes, if we did what it took now to set things right, it would be very painful. Lots of people who are feeding at the government trough would have to cut back. However, if we put off this house cleaning until we owe as much as all the other countries in the world put together, which may happen by 1999, it's going to be that much more painful. Not a bad dream, but a nightmare. The only true cure is a rough discipline that few countries' populations have the guts for, but those who do come to call the tune for the rest of the world. The discipline? A country has to learn to compete and innovate. It must lower its costs. A manufacturer has to take another country's tape recorder and say, okay, let's put 12 new bells and whistles on it. Let's make it work as well as the German tape recorder at a better price. How can a government aid this? Over the past 30 years, the British government might not have printed so much money and might have maintained a balanced budget. This would have held up the value of sterling and forced the country to be more competitive, to make better products, and to innovate. The government and the people should have taken the pain, borne it. Yes, the price would have been high. It would have cost them unemployment, even high unemployment. It would have caused some poverty, but it would have enabled the British people to come out on the other side, as have the French and the Chileans. In the 70s, the British government under Prime Minister Callaghan came to the conclusion that Britain badly needed a semiconductor industry if it were to compete in the world of the future. That same government turned down establishing a British Silicon Valley because it would have created too many millionaires, and it was philosophically opposed to people getting rich. As the English learned for a while in the 1970s, and the Italians are learning now, Eventually, the worldwide market in currencies and bonds is going to say, "Okay, guys, it's over, whether you like it or not." Someday, the world markets will refuse to buy more US dollars and bonds. Can you blame them? Would you buy overpriced bonds and currencies? Unfortunately, it usually takes war, hyperinflation, depression, or some other grave calamity that impoverishes the populace to bring a people to the place where they'll follow such a tough economic necessity. After all, Germany and Japan were forced into it by the devastation of World War II. The South Americans were forced into it by 70 years of mismanagement. Usually, politicians cannot, will not, stay the course. Oddly enough, the French have maintained such a discipline. For 30 to 35 years after the war, they continually devalued and inflated. They nationalized the banks and many large industrial companies. They imposed price controls to curb exorbitant profits and passed a large tax on millionaires, not only on their income, but also on their wealth. "We'll have easy money too," they said, "which will bring prosperity and good times." Of course, it didn't work. French growth stagnated as the rest of the world recovered. Not only did unemployment rise, but French politicians constantly devalued the franc. Of all people, the socialists under Mitterrand in 1983 said, "We got to change this policy. It hasn't worked. Now what we're going to do is tie ourselves to the Bundesbank." This was the German central bank, renowned for its monetary discipline and constitutionally required to maintain a sound currency. "We're going to cut taxes, encourage investing, have low inflation, and make this country change into being an efficient producer of high-quality competitive goods. We're going to develop our economy for the long term." To my amazement, the French government did what was necessary. It stayed the course despite the social pain. Maybe it was able to do this because it was socialist. The French people might not have put up with the hard road if the capitalists had done it, because they would have thought the capitalists were interested only in helping their rich friends. If only a right-winger like Nixon could go to China, perhaps only socialists could insist on social pain. Keeping a rein on the money supply meant that the French businessman was hopping mad over the cost of capital. It meant high unemployment, which meant the French voters weren't all that happy either. But it forced the French to be more competitive, to be willing to go in and work hard for reasonable wages, the essence of increased productivity and a more competitive product. Their economy became more efficient. The uncompetitive enterprises went out of business, merged, or adapted. The French figured out how to innovate and sell to the rest of the world. Politically speaking, the socialists were able to bring this about because their people were fed up. From the 50s on, there had been a constant turnover in government. The people themselves finally realized that they had to bite the bullet, take their economic pain, clean their house, sober up, if they were to straighten out their country. To a government in economic trouble, printing money and inflation look as appealing as does a fifth of whiskey to a long-time drunk, but it never makes the long-term situation better. There's not a country or a people that has gone through what it takes to put its currency on a sound footing that has ever regretted it any more than an alcoholic who's hit bottom regrets being sober after he's been on the wagon for 10 years. Actually, now the French economy is in better shape than the German. Lower inflation, better balance of trade, better everything. They've been off the bottle for a long time, yet ironically, the market still doesn't believe them because it has a folk memory that runs, "Who are these guys trying to kid? We've known the French for 100 years and they always give in. They're weak. They're pansies." Hitler thought that, and Kaiser Wilhelm thought that. The franc will come up against periodic pressure in the currency markets till the French convince them that they really and truly mean business, the way the Germans, Dutch, and Chileans have. What about the gold standard as a way to enforce currency discipline? Can we, should we, return to the gold standard? Under it, by law, you can turn in a certain amount of your paper money for an ounce of gold. It's a way of making governments honest, of requiring them to keep a sound set of books. There are several cogent arguments against the gold standard, one being that the world should not be held hostage to two of the largest gold producers, Russia and South Africa, both of which are potentially explosive. Even if they stabilize, why give them a huge advantage? My problem with the gold standard is twofold. One, it might work. A return to the gold standard would lead to strict discipline for our politicians and ultimately to hardship for our excess-ridden economy. When the pain became too great, the politicians would blame the problem on gold and abandon it, as they have always done. Back in 1973, Nixon took us off a modified gold standard when the pain of complying with its demands became more than the politicians would face up to. 2. It might not work. That is, the politicians would find ways to fudge, avoid, or reduce its discipline to save themselves. As a typical example, the gold coins from the latter days of the Roman Empire contained less gold than the coins of the early dynamic period. Any gold standard system our politicians put in place might well not be sound, yet all of us would be duped into thinking it was secure. By the time the fraud became clear, it would be too late for many. There is a simple, low-cost way to solve the whole problem of the gold standard and its discipline on money. Eliminate the capital gains tax on gold. Today, it's impossible to transact business in gold, or to index transactions to it, or do anything else except paper money, because a huge capital gains tax is imposed every time gold is used. Eliminate the tax, and people will vote with their wallets, which is what the gold standard is all about anyway. That is, whenever the politicians debase a currency or an economy, more and more people will turn to gold. As the use of gold rises, the bankruptcy of a government's policies will be clear, even to the people in the street. They will insist that their transactions be carried out in gold rather than paper, fiat money. Needless to say, an even better solution would be to eliminate the capital gains tax on all hard assets. Then, whenever politicians debase the currency, the market would revert to gold, silver, diamonds, corn, lumber, or whatever else people saw fit to make their medium of commerce. We are now precluded from these choices because everything, except the governmental monopoly on paper money, is subject to a capital gains tax. The one thing the Japanese journalist didn't ask me was what local financial assets were undervalued. The answer was, and still is, seats on the Japanese futures exchanges. As everybody knows, for years the Japanese commodity markets have been closed to the outside world. As a result, their commodity exchanges are small and undeveloped. On a par with those in the States 50 years ago, they trade mostly local silk and rice. I classify this government interference in markets as statism. That is, the politicians have protected the country's agricultural sector, causing its citizens to pay 6 times the world price for rice. The farmers' use of land for rice has driven up the per-acre price of all land to absurd heights. Since land values are overblown, no one can afford anything but cramped housing far from city centers. Now, however, the Japanese are being forced to open their markets to foreign industrial products and commodities. They have copied some foreign trading operations, setting up an index futures contract for their stock market and one for the yen bond market. Part of opening up their financial markets is to let foreigners buy seats on their exchanges. How can an investor profit? A clever person should buy a membership on the Japanese commodities exchanges. First, it's dirt cheap, and second, there will be an explosive price increase as more and more commodities trading takes place in Japan. Seats on the Japanese stock market hit $6 million, while those on the commodities exchanges are a fraction of this. Look at the comparables in the United States. Membership on the New York Stock Exchange sells for well over $500,000, and the price of a seat on a hot futures market is an equivalent amount. Buying such a seat is a cheap way to enter these markets. Regional commodities markets will continue to develop and integrate further into worldwide markets. In a few years, every commodity will be traded at every hour around the globe, and at that point, these seats will soar in price. Buying one of these seats satisfies 2 basic principles of my investment approach. First, we found something that's cheap. Second, a dynamic change in its favor is about to occur. These principles may sound simple, but they are keys to successful investing and will repay the closest study. Most investors don't have a problem knowing when an investment is cheap. The hard part is knowing that a change is about to occur in the near future. This is where studying markets and their history is so important. In my finance classes, I insist that my students practice by studying everything that could have been known at a particular time in history and by making their own predictions. What would have told you in 1929 that the New York market was going to crash? How could you have known after the war between the states that the Manhattan real estate market would soar? After World War II, Montgomery Ward predicted a recession and drew in its horns. Sears Roebuck correctly predicted a boom, expanded, and made a killing. What told an investor which company to bet on? True, I may get the timing wrong. I'm usually early. As I've never been a particularly good trader, someone who runs in and out of positions and gets the timing right, I invest for the long haul. A futures seat in Japan is an opportunity that an investor can hold for 5, 10, 15 years, making 10, 20, or 40 times his original stake. This was such an attractive investment, and Tokyo was such an exciting, vibrant city with so many investment opportunities that Tabitha and I strongly considered moving there after our trip was done. Not that the Japanese don't have their problems. Despite the hype in United States newspapers, the kids don't work as hard as their parents. The children of the current generation of Japanese ant or bee-like workers aren't going to make their parents' sacrifices. The second generation of wealth never does, and when wealth reaches the third and fourth generations, often little vitality is left. Until recent years, Japan's surging population growth was good for the country. By the mid-'80s, it had fallen to an all-time low of 0.6% annually. Today, it's half that. In comparison, the population in the United States is increasing at a rate double this, in South Korea triple. Japan's huge and aging workforce represents a bulge that will reach retirement age by the turn of the century. When it does, the proportion of workers to retirees will become unfavorable, producing economic and societal strains. In addition, the Japanese don't have natural resources, a huge problem for a nation relying on industrial production. Somewhere along the line, the Japanese must get a big natural resource base. Until they can find one to buy, they're either going to have to conquer one, as they tried to do in the 30s, which is unlikely, or eventually decline, somewhat more likely. On the other hand, there is a strategic mix for the 21st century that might work for them. The Chinese, who also need resources for their massive population, have more labor than they have the capital to put to use. Siberia has more land and resources and no labor or money, while Japan has capital but nothing in resources and not enough labor. I can see Japanese capital combining with Chinese labor to develop Siberia's vast resources into fantastic wealth. As we were riding about in Tokyo, we felt a tremor, an earthquake, we found out, 4.5 on the Richter scale. I was surprised. I thought any earthquake would be the end of Japan, but it turned out that it has them all the time. It's every 50 to 100 years that a big one comes along and knocks down everything. The time to move on was approaching. Reluctantly, I had to face Tabitha's plans. "Do you want to come?" I asked her. "I've had enough," she said. "Siberia, it's going to be rougher than China." I had to agree. No one had ever said a good word about driving across Siberia. "But it won't be the same without you," I said. "I want you with me." She smiled. "You don't need anybody, Jim." "I need you," I said, and then softened the moment with some humor. "Who's going to fix my bike? Who's going to keep me company? Who's going to get me by those huge border guards with her Nordic good looks? They're liable to put me in jail." "I hate my bike," she said. "I spend all my time listening to its rattles and knocks, expecting it to conk out." I remembered those cold mornings when she had had to give it 1 or 2 dozen kicks to get it started. "Your bike?" I said, with a burst of hope rising in me. "Is that all? Come on, let's go to the BMW place. Let's get you a bike you like." "A new bike?" "Anything you want." Anything. It was true I would bull on without her, but I would miss her steadiness and mechanical ability. We made a good traveling team. Where I would throw myself around with border officials in an effort to break through their bureaucratic stupidity, she would sweet-talk our way past them. But I might have hired all that. What I couldn't hire and would sorely miss was her wit, her excitement, our laughter together, and our teamwork, our partnership. More than any woman I'd ever known, she was game for adventure and held up under adversity. To top all this off, I was by no means easy to live with, and she understood me and put up with me. I realized that she was my ideal partner in every way. She paused. She had come to love motorcycling, and the prospect of a new bike thrilled anybody who did. "I'll look," she said in a guarded voice, "but I'm not making any promises." At the dealer where my bike was being overhauled, she fell in love with a BMW R80. Astride its new seat, gripping the handlebars, breathing the heady aroma of new bike, and reveling in the bike's electric starter, she beamed at me and said, "God, you're persuasive." I smiled back. I was halfway there. Shortly after, she agreed to stay on. We shipped her old bike back to the States. This new bike cheered her up immediately. With excitement, we shopped for the dozens of travel items we had been unable to find in China and wouldn't be likely to find in Siberia. Brake fluid, toothpaste, knit shirts, razor blades, cables, brake pads, and a collection of nuts, bolts, and screws. To travel so lightly through such primitive parts of the world, you must think ahead. We bought new helmets and special tiny tents and sleeping bags for motorcyclists. So after this brief interlude in the first world, we set out again, this time toward one of the wildest parts of the world, Siberia. Till now, the Siberian cities across the Sea of Japan had been only names on the map: Nakhodka, Vladivostok, Khabarovsk. Both of us were excited, but of course we felt some apprehension. Where were we going to stay? Would we have to camp out a lot? Would the black market continue to see to it that we got gas? How would the Russians out there feel about Americans? And what about the danger the Russians back in New York had called tigre, tigers? Would they attack us? Chapter 12. At the Edge of the World. We landed in the new city of Nakhodka, a few miles east of the larger port of Vladivostok, which was the home of the Soviet Navy and thus closed to foreign visitors. A village before World War II, Nakhodka was now a major fishing port, a city of dull gray apartment houses spread high above and surrounding a sheltered bay. It was easy to believe that we were on the moon or on the edge of the world, a place where we could fall into some bottomless ravine we scarcely knew existed. At customs in Siberia, the officers didn't know what a carnet was and merely handed us a stamped piece of paper instead of marking our passports. I was amazed that they were so lax. This meant we could have sold our motorcycles and made a large duty-free profit, something we had no intention of doing, but which most other borders were careful to prohibit. Of course, what this told me was how little vehicular traffic came through here. At the hotel, we asked where we could store our bikes, hoping for a parking garage or a sheltered courtyard. At the police station, we were told, right next door. There, we locked them behind a wooden fence and, as usual, chained the wheels and covered them with tarp. Covered bikes excite much less curiosity from bystanders than those standing brazenly ready to be tinkered with. In addition to the 2 spare tires on our chained-up bikes, we had 2 extra spares and a rim. The hotel management suggested we protect them by storing them in a large footlocker in the lobby, which was padlocked. Excited, we set out on foot to explore this new world. Part of what gave Nakhodka its otherworldly impression was the lack of street life and stores. I'd seen backwater ports before, even back in Alabama. The port of Mobile was long past its prime, but compared with the rust and broken equipment here, it was a model of repair. There was no security around the docks. Goods were piled up in such a fashion that anybody could walk off with anything. Few people were in its drab streets, even downtown. To our surprise, in a port city of 170,000, there weren't more than 20 stores, each specialized, whereas most cities of this size would have boasted hundreds of small shops of one kind or another. There was a single children's clothing store, a single grocery store, a single auto parts store, and a single hardware store. After all, this was communism, and why would you need to, comrade? Surely that was wasteful, except for the bakeries, full of inexpensive, extraordinary bread, baked every day. The other stores shocked us. They were virtually empty of both goods and people. The hardware store's shelves were bare, except for a few nuts, bolts, and hinges. The grocery store sported 100 4-liter jars of birch juice, a drink that tasted like a cross between apple juice and grape juice, a few cans of domestic condensed milk, some bags of flour, and little else. To call another an auto parts store glorified it. It displayed a tire or two, a single motorcycle horn, and a couple of mirrors. Where did people get what they needed? We asked ourselves. We came across one small bank, but it seemed to be withering from a lack of business. Sticking to my usual methodology, I changed a few dollars to obtain sample rubles and a receipt to show officials that we had done the right thing, but we kept our eyes open for the currency black market, the real market. As I kept in touch with my family and maintained my log by frequently sending postcards to my parents, I asked for the cards at the hotel and in the cave-like stores. Not only did they not exist, not only wasn't there a stationery store, but there wasn't even a place to buy a pencil or a pad of paper. After pushing, I was told maybe I could find something at the post office. Perplexed, but glad I'd had the forethought to bring along extra ballpoint pens, I hunted it up. The post office wasn't as inviting as Mrs. Campion's back in Ireland, or the country post offices I had grown up with in Alabama. It looked like a government building anywhere. Cement floor, horrible lighting, and 3 or 4 clerks sitting around doing nothing, its gray inner walls decorated with a couple of severe portraits of Lenin and Gorbachev. Fortunately, it displayed the few items it had for sale, and one of them was indeed a postcard. There was no picture on it, and the paper itself appeared to be flimsy oak tag, but at least it was a postcard. Who were the customers, I wondered? Then it hit me. Not many people here would have a reason to go to the post office. You didn't get your bills through the mail, you didn't pay them through the mail, and you certainly didn't get any junk mail. The only reason to use the post office was to write to somebody or to receive a letter, but I came to learn there wasn't much paper, and that the Russians often used telegrams, which were faster and more reliable. The telegraph system and the Trans-Siberian Railroad, both built under the Tsars by capitalists, were the only systems touching the ordinary Russian's life that worked. About all that was on display besides the postcards were stamps and envelopes. I believe the only place in the Soviet Union you could buy an envelope was at the post office. At the counter I smiled, pointed at the postcard display, and held up 3 fingers. The woman clerk looked at me blankly. I smiled again and laid a 10-ruble note on the counter. I held my 3 fingers up higher, and with my other hand tapped the postcard in the display. 3, I said slowly, hoping to force onto her the platonic ideal of the number. She frowned and shook her head slightly. I went through my pantomime again, and this time she took a step back, as if I were suggesting a shameful sexual act. Even after I had gone through this charade 10 times, the clerk didn't understand what I wanted. Perplexed by her incomprehension, I finally got the manager, Mrs. Fedorov, who smiled and nodded and told me I wanted to send mail to Australia. No, America, I said, enunciating the word syllable by syllable. She understood me at last, but it had taken 15 minutes to buy 3 postcards. I better get more, I thought. As the port through which all the foreigners passed, Nakhodka wasn't exactly the sticks. If it was this hard to get postcards here, what would it be like deeper in Siberia? So I bought a dozen. On my way out, I realized I was experiencing what we'd begun to understand all smart Soviet consumers do. When they have a chance to buy something, they buy all they can of it, because they never know when they're going to find it again. The communists. They'd won the Second World War and put together a great space program, but making and distributing postcards and toothbrushes and hinges had beaten them. Then I began to understand why all this had occurred. These dozen postcards had cost me a total of about 6 cents, which included postage anywhere inside the Soviet Union, possibly a 7,000-mile journey. At the bakery, there was plenty of bread, and at such a low price, 3 kopecks, less than 1/10 of a cent in our money. Farmers fed it to their pigs and boys used loaves for soccer balls. The Soviet Union hadn't raised its prices in 50 years. It sounded good, even great for the consumer. Low rent, postcards for kopecks, inexpensive bread, cheap birch juice, and low-cost hinges. But the flip side was that they had almost no consumer goods except bread, which of course was the one item not even the communists dared allow to run out. Even if they were communists and noble, even though this was the largest empire the world had ever seen, state fiat could not overturn the laws of supply and demand. That is, by keeping these prices low, the communists had robbed everyone, including the state and the party, of any real-world incentive to produce and distribute every product. What possible incentive could there be to make hinges or socks when every pair lost money? This was the society that legislated that it was a crime, one called speculation, for an individual, organization, or the state to sell anything for more than it had paid for it. I didn't think even the most ardent Marxist professor at a Western university would believe that any economic unit could survive without tacking on something for its overhead, and possibly its profit. No, the real crime here was the perversion of human nature, the original communist notion that the natural way of trade and commerce that had existed throughout the world for thousands of years was somehow evil. The real crime was the misery, the shortages, the shoddy goods, and the lack of opportunity perpetuated by the communists on the Soviet people for decades. Here was one of the 20th century's largest experiments in statism, an experiment with 290 million lives, and what a failure it had been. By now we had a small collection of maps in German, French, and Russian. When I sat down to plan our route to Moscow, 6,000 miles away, I found that while the cities listed on our visas were represented with the mapmaker's usual little white circles, something was missing. The roads between them. Back west around Moscow were the mapmaker's red, brown, and yellow lines that marked roads. Over the 4,000 miles from here to Omsk, however, there were no connecting roadways, not a red, yellow, white, or even broken road line. The cross ties of the train line were clearly marked, but not the road. "Maybe there aren't any roads," said Tabitha, giving me a fisheye, ever the realist. "Come on," I answered. "They just haven't surveyed out here. You forget how huge Siberia is. It's cheaper to make the maps without running all over Siberia measuring the place. Besides, the German and French map makers probably couldn't get in." "What about the Russian map makers?" she asked. "They couldn't get in either?" Ignoring her humor, I looked around. People stroked their chins, and a faraway look crept into their eyes. Some were sure there was a road to Khabarovsk, the next big town westward, but even they were uncertain about what lay beyond it, toward Chita and Ulan-Ude. "There have to be roads connecting these cities," I said to Tabitha. Her fisheye had grown stronger. "How can you be so sure?" I didn't have a particularly good answer, except who ever heard of a country's major cities a few hundred miles apart without connecting roads? It just didn't make sense. In all my travels, I've found that locals know less about traveling in their country than do travelers. What New Yorker can tell you how to get to Kansas City, and what the roads are like to get there? Who in Montana can tell you how to get to Birmingham, Alabama? In Russia, the locals knew less than usual, as Russians didn't travel. If your relatives never moved away, and shopping was no better 100 or 200 miles down the road, Why go? But if my informants were unclear about the route, they were quite sure about one thing. Whatever route did exist, it was not paved. That was all right. I'd grown up on unpaved roads in the backwoods of Alabama, and since then I'd traveled on my share of unpaved road, lots of it. Here in Nakhotka, we met some dock workers who told us, through one of their number who spoke English, that they had learned only the year before that it was legal for foreigners to leave their countries and return without special permission. In the Soviet Union, they'd always been told that if they left the country, they couldn't come back except under exceptional circumstances, and that was true throughout the world. Here was another way the communists controlled their people, another way they'd brainwashed them. These workers were furious at having been lied to, at finding out the world was different from the one they'd been told about. Even though the Soviet Union was the largest country in the world, it was tormented by memories of prior invasions, from the Mongols 700 years before, down to those of Napoleon and Hitler. For many scores of years, their leaders had been consumed by the need to defend their long, vulnerable perimeter, which had pushed them to conquer more and more territories. As generations of Russian novelists have described to us, the Russian soul wants to be different, to be Russian and Slavic, to be wild and free and moody. However, it also yearns to be a part of Europe, to embrace logic, order, and civilization. The Russian soul longs for freedom and originality, yet rightly is terrified that new ideas will stir up anarchy and chaos, for both Russia and the Soviet Union had been held together by fragile bonds. With all this in mind, we went to visit the head of the docks, the boss of the whole shooting match here, a high communist official sitting under a picture of Lenin. He spoke excellent English. I asked why the dock workers had been lied to, how their bitter anger affected their work. "Why do you ask me these questions?" he shot back. "I'm as angry as everybody else. Don't think it's us against them. I'm fed up with communism too. From Gorbachev on down, we're all furious. I'm as angry as those guys on the docks. Life here is a nightmare." This was a year before the coup in 1991. The army was fed up too, even then uninterested in taking over a bankrupt state, one that, they saw clearly, they had no idea how to run. "You Australia?" we were asked in a restaurant by a large, friendly Russian with a strong accent. "No, American," I answered. "No good beer, yeah?" "No, beer is good," I replied, wondering if something was being lost in the translation. We were drinking vodka. "Yes, near no good. Australia better. Don't stay near." He shuffled off, and I asked Tabitha what that was all about. "Beer is good in Australia, but not here," she said. "He'd like to be somewhere else." "Was he drunk?" "No, just practicing his English." After the fifth person brought up Australia, it finally penetrated. We made inquiries, and to our surprise, learned that an Australian farmer and his family lived only a few miles from Nakhotka. We drove out to visit, and indeed, there was an Australian farmer. A day laborer on a farm back in Australia, Robert Sokob had left what sounded like tough conditions and had been here several months. He had become discouraged with his prospects back home, and, like immigrants everywhere, came here to make more money. Both his and his wife Lena's grandparents had emigrated out of Russia. They'd been white Russians. Both sets of grandparents moved south to China in the 20s or 30s to escape Stalin's takeover. When the communists came yet again and took over China, they fled to Australia. Despite their Russian roots, Robert and Lena and their two sons, Peter and Paul, and their two daughters, Anna and Alexandra, sounded as Australian as could be. Robert was about 40, Lena a few years younger. Both declared that even after 3 generations, they thought they might make it in Russia. They paid 5.5 rubles, about $1, as their monthly rent, and about half that for electricity. The couple said they missed the good roads, friends, and beer from back home. The Russians had allocated Robert 100 hectares, about 250 acres, on which he proposed to raise cattle. He had acquired more assets to work with in one stroke than he would have been able to in a lifetime back in Australia. He said that the Russians at the embassy in Australia had tried to dissuade him, saying he didn't know what he was getting into, but he had insisted on coming. A chance to have his own place had to be better than the meager day wages he had been earning. He would take the chance, the immigrant's eternal gamble. Several Russian magazines had come a long distance to interview him. After all, he was probably the only non-ideological person to emigrate to the Soviet Union in 50 years. They gave him a house, but it was a house like all of them out here. No indoor plumbing, rudimentary electricity, and a primitive kitchen, not much more than running water and a wooden coal stove. Almost every Alabama sharecropper had more. Lena, a bit shy and reserved, seemed perplexed and still stunned by the move and the harshness of their new country. Their 19-year-old son, Peter, wanted so little to do with this plan that he was enlisting in the Soviet Navy. Their 14-year-old daughter, Anna, was even less enthusiastic. Of course, 14-year-olds aren't too pleased about anything, but this was life without music, no rock and roll, no radio, no telephone, no pictures of pop stars, no soda fountain, no nothing. The 8-year-old girl, Alexandra, was non-committal, and 5-year-old Paul was happy to have a bicycle. Other kids came over to play because they didn't have one. Every day Lena went to school with Anna and Alexandra to help them because the classes were in Russian and they didn't understand much yet. Lena treated us to birch juice and vegetables, all she had. Robert said he wanted to build a proper house, but it was dawning on him that without a corner lumberyard, it was almost impossible. "I go around all day trying to get things, lumber, cement, nails," he said. If the Russians had something, often they just gave it to him, wanting to be helpful to an immigrant. "For weeks I've been trying to get gravel to put on the driveway to cover this damn mud," he said. "I put the word out, and every now and then a truck shows up and dumps a load of gravel. I can't pay for it. They don't want to be paid for it." The Soviets had promised him a second 100 hectares, but they made it clear that no matter how hard he worked the land, they wouldn't allow him to sell either parcel. He could pass the farm on to his children. Of course, in 30 years, who knew under what form of government he'd be living? I remembered that there had been a huge argument in the Soviet Union. Yes, we want to privatize, they'd say, but do we just give people land? Won't they then become speculators? Most farmers answered back, "I'm not interested in your 30-year lease. I'll improve the land and you'll take it back? No thanks." I thought raising cattle out here was a totally absurd concept, but maybe he would make it. If he had the staying power to last 20 or 30 years, maybe he would become a cattle baron in eastern Siberia. I hoped so, for his family's sake. When we went to leave Nakhodka, we opened the footlocker in the hotel lobby and found our rim and extra tires had been stolen. I insisted that Boris, the desk clerk, find them, but he only shrugged. "Why would anybody want a BMW wheel and tires?" I asked Tabitha. "You've been in the stores," she said. "Why wouldn't they?" She was right. If I looked hard enough, I'd probably find a BMW tire and wheel on someone's homemade wheelbarrow, or sitting in a living room as an exotic status symbol. Thank God we had put our bikes in the police compound. I resolved to continue doing this throughout the Soviet Union. Luckily, I had set up an account with the BMW dealer back in Japan who overhauled my bike. It took a number of frantic phone calls that made buying postcards look like a snap, but I managed to order an extra rim and tires to be shipped to Khabarovsk, where we expected to be in a few days. So we set out to drive the 6,000 miles to Moscow across the taiga, which I had now learned was Russian for the Siberian wilds. Losing such important spare parts so early, before we'd even left the port city, brought home that if something went wrong in the middle of the taiga, we'd be in big trouble. Chapter 13. Across the Wild Taiga. You can set down the whole of the continental United States inside Siberia without touching its borders, and you can also put Alaska and all the countries of Europe, excluding Russia itself, into the remaining margin. After doing this, you'll still have enough room for a second state of Texas. Foreigners were not allowed in certain strategic cities in the Soviet Union, except under extraordinary circumstances. The best road to Khabarovsk was via Vladivostok, which was one of these closed cities because it was the home of the Soviet Navy. To our surprise, we weren't stopped by the military police, but sped right through it. I figured we were too far from Moscow for the local gendarmes to be efficient. True to what we'd been told, the paved road out to Khabarovsk quickly turned into gravel, big baseball-sized stones on which it was almost impossible to ride. Afraid we'd go down, we couldn't drive fast. At such a slow speed, when our wheels hit a grapefruit-sized boulder, the bikes would try to spin out of our hands and push us over. Driving was a constant battle with the road. Every 50 or 75 miles, Tabitha fell over, and I'd get off to help her. I got through this unscathed, but she again became ready to give up. She might now have 10,000 miles of motorcycling experience, but very few motorcyclists had experienced conditions like these. Seduced by the new bike, she had come from Japan against her better judgment, and her heart wasn't in it. The road was just too terrible, the thousands of miles ahead too great. "Damn it," said Tabitha, cranking up her bike after her dozenth spill. "I'm going home." "Home? When we get to Khabarovsk, I'm getting on a plane and going back to New York." "It'll get better," I said. "Now how do you know that, Jim Rogers?" she asked, furious. "Well, we'll get used to it. Surely it can't be like this all the way to Moscow." "Why not?" "Well, it just can't. This is like our Far West back in the 19th century. They haven't got around to putting in roads this far from Moscow." "Bullshit," she said, flinging out her hands to take in the miles of gravel in front and behind us. "No road on the map, and lo and behold, no road here. No road on the map to Omsk, and I'll bet there's no road there either." I knew the driving was beating the hell out of her, but I wasn't happy about going on without her. "Look, you said you'd come," I said. "I need you. We've learned so much together. Our partnership is stronger than this. You said there would be roads. This isn't a road. It's whitewater rafting on a motorcycle. I want to go home." "Okay, fine," I said, beaten. "I'll put you on a plane at the next airport." I hoped by the time we got to one this would have passed. We pressed on, slipping and sliding on that damn baseball-sized gravel. It took us 5 long days to go from Nakhodka to Khabarovsk. 5 days of slipping and falling. 5 days of wrestling with our bikes. But it wasn't all bad, not by a long shot, and we didn't travel the entire day. This was open country with pure, clear air. The flowers were in bloom, and puff seedlings more than once swirled around us like warm snow on their journey to seed the earth. In one village, Tabitha was taken for a traveling movie star, and the people stared at her blondness and touched her in wonderment. They had never seen foreigners. In Siberia, we were as exotic as the first Europeans were to the Native Americans. In Khabarovsk, Tabitha hadn't changed her mind. The plane wouldn't leave for several days, so the question of what she was going to do hung fire. I argued with her, angry because I wanted her with me and she wanted to go back. Part of the excitement of a trip like this was having someone to share it with. "No, these are hard roads and it's just a bitch," she said. "This isn't my dream, it's yours. Go around the world 6 times if you want. I'm going home." She bedded down in a separate hotel room to show me she meant business. Perturbed, I took a walk to reflect. Khabarovsk was a city on a hill, sort of a cliff overlooking an enormously wide river, at least a mile or so across. I began to tramp about. It was beginning to dawn on me what I had taken on in committing myself to this trip, and that it was more than I'd expected. Yes, I had known many of the roads would be rough, But even though I was an experienced writer and had been in many primitive countries, I hadn't realized how rough and for quite how long they would go on that way. Still, I was plenty game, but I could well understand that a novice might not be. My feelings related back to my Wall Street days, as well as those I'd spent with students at Columbia University. I didn't teach the kind of finance usually taught at business schools, the kind dreamed up by professors whose only relation to real money was their monthly paycheck. I taught what I knew, how to invest the way I invested, how to think about markets and opportunities the way I thought. It wasn't orthodox in a time of computers and complicated mathematical models of the economy, the stock market, and index derivatives. However, I'd used my way of thinking not only to make some money, but to keep it. If you ask 1,000 people if they want to be rich, every one except the poet and the mystic will say yes. When you explain what is needed to become rich, maybe 600 of that initial 998 will say, "No problem, I can do that." But when push comes to shove, when they have to sacrifice everything else in their lives, having a spouse and children, a social life, possibly a spiritual life, maybe every pleasure, to meet their goal, almost all of them, too, will fall away. Only about 6 of the original 1,000 will continue on the hard path. Most of us don't have the discipline to stay focused on a single goal for 5, 10, or 20 years, giving up everything to bring it off. But that's what's necessary to become an Olympic champion, a world-class surgeon, or a Kirov ballerina. Even then, of course, it may be all in vain. You may make a single mistake that wipes out all the work. It may ruin the sweet, lovable self you were at 17. That old adage is true. You can do anything in life, you just can't do everything. That's what Bacon meant when he said a wife and children were hostages to fortune. If you put them first, you probably won't run the 3.5-minute mile, make your first $10 million, write the great American novel, or go around the world on a motorcycle. Such goals take complete dedication. Of course, not all of us believe that the goals the obsessive among us take on are good things. Was it sane of Captain Ahab to chase Moby Dick? Was it necessary for Roger Bannister to break the 4-minute mile? Was it essential for Edmund Hillary to be the first man to climb Everest? These were goals to which each man was willing to dedicate himself. Ahab drove his men with him to his goal, where all but one died. Even though he may be remembered with affection after he's won the war, during battle, the colonel is hated for pushing his men into the enemy's jaws. Well, corny as it may sound, I was totally absorbed and dedicated when I worked on Wall Street, and I was like that about this trip. I'd thrown myself into it, going to excess, the way I've done everything my whole life. I'd made up my mind to do it, and to do it in good time, not to take a decade. Nothing was going to stop me or slow me down. However, there wasn't a lady friend I cared for more than Tabitha, and to have her along as a companion had come to be as important as the trip itself. Coming to this realization was a surprise to me in and of itself, as I'd never felt that way before about a traveling companion. If she would continue, I would strive to accommodate her more, although I wasn't going to give up the trip because she was uncomfortable. If she couldn't handle it, I understood that. I would put her and the new bike on the plane back to New York and continue without her. It wouldn't be as much fun. I would be terribly sad, but I'd get it done. The black market again found me in the person of a burly mobster named Alex, who wanted to sell me Russian army belt buckles, hats, and trinkets for hard currency. Alex was jovial and wary, open and guarded, the epitome of everything I'd always heard about the Russian soul. It turned out he had been in jail, a place that sounded even more dreadful than prisons back home. All the prisoners slept together in big barracks. They ate little but gruel and worked on the roads 12 hours a day, except when they worked on the railroad. His crime, he said, was that he kept telling the workers that capitalism was better and that communism wasn't the way the world should be, which sounded to me like poppycock he used to flatter Western customers. On close questioning, he said he had gone to jail for forging his work papers and his time card. I decided he had put down that he was at work while he was out hustling dollars on the black market. He said he could get me anything. Just name it. Girls, booze, every sort of contraband, as long as I paid him in hard currency. Ever the intrepid traveler and always eager for an adventure, I bought a few dollars worth of trinkets and got him to introduce me to the bootlegger, who made vodka, naturally. As it happened, we bumped into Alex in the park the next day, when he happened to have his girls for hire with him, a couple of plump, stolid 18-year-olds who, despite their youth, didn't look particularly attractive. Notwithstanding the fears of Western religions about communism unleashing free love and rampant sex, the world's oldest profession seemed to have handily survived 70 years of scientific materialism. His eyes gleaming, Alex drifted off with me to discuss my purchasing more Russian metals. His great goal, he now confided, was to buy a car in Japan for 50,000 yen, or less than $300, a used car. In Japan they throw such cars away, he said. The Russians would let him bring it in duty-free, and he could turn his $300 car into maybe 60,000 rubles, or $3,500, a way to get rich. He needed hard currency to start this process. Rubles were no good, as the Japanese didn't want them. In the real world, the only money that counts is real money. Alex declared that after he'd done it once, he would do it again. Tabitha stumbled on a woman's clinic and got to know the doctor there, Natasha Zolotarev, who talked about the more intimate details of Soviet life. With none of the restraints imposed by religion, few movies, and the state TV yet more boring than that in the States, sex was a major pastime in the USSR. Dr. Zolotarev said abortion and IUDs were the country's only two means of birth control. Frequently, the clinic didn't have IUDs, and even when it did, the quality was poor. Abortion, which she detested, was the principal means of birth control. The average Russian woman had 10 to 15 abortions in her lifetime. As a result, 30% of the women wound up having emergency hysterectomies. It was clear that if AIDS arrived in the Soviet Union, there was a strong chance of its devastating the population. Back to sleeping in the same room, we were waiting for the tires from Japan and for Tabitha's outbound plane. One day on the street, we saw a huge, unruly mob outside a store, the sort that gathered wherever anything was for sale. It was a jewelry store, and we went in. The mob was more ferocious, desperate, and frantic than usual. A shipment of gold jewelry had come in, and because gold was such an honest store of value, these Siberians were desperate to cash out of rubles and buy gold. Intrigued by the importance of gold to the Soviet Union, we went to see the head of the local state gold mining organization, Igor Sosnin. He was the bureaucrat in charge of all the Pacific Far Eastern gold mines. I remembered how significant gold and oil were to the Soviet Union. In the States, the head of a mere mining operation wouldn't be that important, but in the Soviet Union, it was a different story. Igor was a big guy, the equivalent of the head of IBM or GM in the United States. I especially wanted to speak to Igor about gold and other commodities because of what I understood had been happening to their raw materials and what would be happening in the future. The Soviet Union in the 20th century is a fascinating study in national survival. Back in the 20s, the Communist Party lived on the euphoria of surviving the First World War and the Revolution, but by the 30s, the country's economy had fallen apart. Millions starved, and Stalin hung on to power by executing tens of thousands of his enemies. Others he sent to the network of concentration camps called the Gulag, which grew in population from 30,000 in 1928 to 8 million in 1938. The country was on the verge of collapse. Hitler, however, saved Stalin by giving him a menace against which to rally his people, staving off his overthrow and the country's economic ruin. We helped him too, with our Lend-Lease Act program in the Second World War. In the 50s and early 60s, the new colonies in Central Europe, Poland, East Germany, Bulgaria, etc., began to produce new wealth. During the late 60s and 70s, the country was helped by the worldwide commodities boom, as well as by the expansion into the virgin lands of the Central Asian republics. Although the Soviets had no services and manufactured goods that the rest of the world wanted, vast increases in the production of copper, wheat, cotton, palladium, and aluminum gave them a new lease on life. For decades, Russia was the world's largest producer of oil and its second largest producer of gold. Naturally, it put its best people in these important industrial and mining positions. By the 80s, however, the Russians' luck had run out. No longer were they in the right place at the right time. Western central banks, including that of the United States, reined in inflation, bringing to a halt the commodities boom. This cut the economic ground out from under the Soviet Union, which had failed to develop a single industrial or consumer product that the rest of the world wanted. Not only was the commodities boom over, but Soviet managers were operating their lands and mines in precisely the fashion for which their political leaders condemned the West. They had stripped off the easy pickings without a consideration for what the next decade would need. One of my theories was that the Russians would become more and more desperate to hold their ranch together, that is, to service their foreign loans and bring in Western necessities, whether computers or wheat. They would dump gold to earn hard Western currency, which would keep the price of gold low. After all, they didn't have much else to dump. I asked Igor right out if they were dumping gold. He wouldn't answer me directly, but we did have a long general discussion. "We're starting co-ops now," he said. "They're very efficient producers." He even introduced us to some co-op owners at a big lunch out in the country, the best meal we had in this part of the world. Their chief, Georgy Abramov, put on the dog: soup, fish, good vegetables and salads, vodka, wine, and tea. We learned that the co-op had been established for only a year, but that it was a rousing success. I gathered co-op was a Russian euphemism for a private enterprise devoted to profit. I asked what their territory was. Georgy pointed out on a map what looked to be thousands of square miles. The term co-op dressed up the reality, made it politically more correct to engage in private enterprise, which in the old Soviet Union was on a par socially with belonging to the mafia back in the States. A few guys in a partnership had obtained the franchise to mine gold, raised the money to finance the machinery, and hired 1,000 workers to do the work. Of course, they were forced to sell their newly mined gold to the state. The Russians weren't going to let them ship it to Japan without getting their slice. But if the co-op brought the gold in below the state price, it made a profit the partners could divvy up. Georgy explained how they worked it. They paid their workers more, so they expected them to work harder. They didn't have the encumbrances and bureaucracy of the state's mining operations. They flew the workers for a month at a time into the middle of nowhere, and the workers were glad to go for the extra money. I asked Igor why he hadn't joined with the co-op. "Well," he said, "basically I'm a bureaucrat and I like my position. I'm very powerful. I've worked my way to the top. This is enough. I make enough money for me." Gold has been one of the great mystical elements of finance for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. Back in the 70s, its price went through the roof. Investors were sure all paper money was going to lose its value. However, if they had done their homework and tracked the price of gold back through the centuries, they would have seen long periods when its price went down and stayed there, or didn't move up with other prices. Later on, gold would catch up, but then so would wheat. So would lumber. For centuries, gold's true believers have said that gold alone is a good store of value. On the other hand, over the centuries, a lot of things have been a good store of value, including wheat, lumber, and iron ore. Back in the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt, in response to economic and currency crises, set the price of gold at $35 an ounce, plucking that number out of the air. It had been $21 an ounce. Now, any government could convert the American dollars it held into gold at $35 an ounce. Naturally, everybody who owned gold was happy to fall into line. They received a 67% premium in value. Everybody was delighted to hold dollars. World War II came, which set external disciplines on all countries. In the 30s, of course, the external discipline had been worldwide economic collapse, which meant people didn't move gold around or exchange their currencies for it. There was little demand because economic trade had come to an end. For 37 years, the price of gold was $35 an ounce, which over time came to be a low price. Thus, the production of gold declined for many years, until 1970. This was yet another situation like the one here in Siberia, where the government underpriced an asset, thereby reducing its supply. Maintaining gold at $35 an ounce had been similar to setting the price of gasoline in Russia at a nickel or a dime a gallon and keeping it there. During this 37-year period, few had looked for gold, few gold mines opened, and all mining operations had run down their reserves. The marginal mines had closed. Most gold that had come onto the world market came from South Africa and Russia, where it was cheap to pull it out of the ground. By the 1970s, the price of gold had to go up. It was so cheap that its manufacturing uses had expanded, and demand was increasing partly because its price was so low. Gold was being used in teeth and electronics. Every time a new application came up, manufacturers said, "Let's use gold. That's the cheapest stuff around." So the price had to go up. Not only did the supply keep going down, but the U.S. had currency crises because we were no longer running a sound economy. A lot of people, especially the French, came to us and said, "We want the gold you promised you would swap for dollars." There was a terrific run on Fort Knox. Pressures for gold prices to rise grew in the 50s and 60s because the American government had begun to run an unsound economy. Trade deficits, printing money, the whole works. The government then tried controls to prop up the value of the dollar artificially. In 1962, our government put on the interest equalization tax to control Americans' investments abroad. Instead of dealing with the problem of a badly valued currency, the government had applied a Band-Aid yet again. So the pressures only intensified, and in 1971 Nixon was forced to say, "Okay guys, I'm not going to do it anymore. I'm changing the rules." Of course, another reason we hadn't had a problem in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s was that the government had made it illegal for Americans to own gold, which made absolutely no sense. The French could own gold, the English could own gold, and the Japanese could own gold, but Americans couldn't. And why? "It's for your own good," the government said, although no one could explain why. We were being protected from ourselves, and yet other nations were taking advantage of us. That's another thing about governments. They think little of changing the rules of the game. You and I would go straight to jail for a lot of things the government does. For instance, making an agreement with investors and then changing the rules. This would be called fraud. Remember the savings and loan crisis? The S&Ls went to the government and said, "Look, we've got real problems here. Our earnings are collapsing. We are going to have serious capital problems. We can't raise money." The government said, "Okay, we'll change the accounting rules just for you. You don't have to say what's really happening." Now, if you and I did that to a public company we ran, we'd flat go to jail for fraud. But our government said it was okay for the S&L industry to change the rules so it could report its accounts fraudulently. As we know, the S&L mess blew up, and we're all paying the price. Did the government blame this on itself? Of course not. The government said, "This was caused by a few greedy guys who were doing fraudulent things." Well, the government was part of it. It had said, "Change your accounting rules to report your books fraudulently, and we'll make it legal." Another Band-Aid that only delayed a crisis. The government didn't just say, "You're allowed to do it." It directed the S&Ls to change their rules. Prolonging the day of reckoning only makes things worse when the pressure finally breaks through. We're finding this out in Yugoslavia now, and we'll find this in the Soviet Union in the future. The coming crisis of the U.S. dollar will be all the worse because we aren't biting the bullet now. So Nixon slammed the window down on the Europeans, the horrible Europeans, saying, "You can't come in here and take our gold, even though it's our own fault for ruining our currency." Demand for gold kept going up. Governments tried to hold it at $35, but they couldn't hang on because everybody came in and cashed in his dollars for gold. In all my years in investing, there's one rule I've prized beyond every other. Always bet against central banks and with the real world. In the 70s, the central banks were defending the United States' artificially low price of gold. Central banks and governments always try to maintain artificial levels, high or low, whether of a currency, a metal, wool, whatever. Usually these prices are absurd, and the market knows they're absurd. When a central bank is defending something, whether it's gold at $35 or the lira at 800 to the dollar, the smart investor always goes the other way. It may take a while, but I promise you'll come out ahead. It's a golden rule of investing. In its collective wisdom, the market always knows that if some people are clinging to an artificially low price of $35, you should keep buying gold at that price. When after 35 years the price of gold was finally released, it went up more than it should have because it had been kept low for so long. Such violent movement happens whenever a price has been kept high or low. This is how markets work. Something, a stock, land, or some other store of value, will bump along at a stable price. Eventually something changes the supply-demand balance. The price starts going up because people realize, hey, they've got a new product, or the railroad is coming through Smithtown. The price goes up for legitimate and sound reasons. There comes a time, though, when people buy land in Smithtown only because its price is going up. At that point, my mother calls me and says, "I want to buy some acres," or "I want to buy this stock." "Why, Mother?" "Well, Jim, it's tripled over the past year," she says in a tone that reminds me of the one Tabitha reserves for calling me a dodo head. "That's not the way you're supposed to do it," I say. "You don't buy it because it's tripled. You buy it before it triples." But this is what happens. People see the price going up and know that here is the gravy train that's going to make them rich. The newspaper will have stories about Joe and Sally, how they're now rich because they bought all this land or a few shares of stock in the coal mine. The price now goes up because the price is going up. This stock, or these acres, become vastly overpriced. The smart guys who bought early, who bought because their family had lived in Smithtown for 100 years, they start selling. They realize that this is becoming unsound. It turns out it's not economical to put yet another General Motors factory here, so new people don't buy land. The demand tapers off. For sound economic reasons, the price starts coming down. Now we have passed the peak. There are now sound economic reasons for manufacturers to put their factories in Taiwan instead of Smithtown. The price of land goes down and goes down, all for sound economic reasons. Now comes the time when people start selling because the price is going down. People look back and say, "Everybody knows you shouldn't own land in Smithtown. It's been going down for 5 years." Everybody now sells because it's the only thing to do. Before there was a buying panic, now there's a selling panic. People scream, "I don't care if land is cheap in Smithtown and I can have a mansion there for virtually nothing. Everybody knows it's a bad place to invest. Get me out." Prices collapse. Everybody knows the price is going to nothing. Panic, the crescendo. That's when you buy, because then it's all over. It'll be a while before things start to come back, but come back they will. Well, this happened to gold, as well as to virtually every other commodity in the history of the world. As I said earlier, back in 1980, learned scholars could show any fool why oil had to go to $100 a barrel. There was no way it couldn't. Mathematically, scientifically, historically, it just had to happen. They ignored one important thing, however. In 1978 and 1979, for the first time in years, the world production of oil exceeded its demand. For years it had looked as if the world was running down oil reserves since we had been consuming more than we had been discovering. But in 1978 and the beginning of 1979, alert investors saw that production and reserves were coming up strongly, which was perfectly in accord with classical economic theory. Whenever you have a high price, you get supply. As supply came back into balance with demand and then exceeded demand, oil made its peak in 1981, rather than going to $100 a barrel. To finish the gold story, if you get out your commodity chart book, you'll see that starting in 1980, for the first time in 45 years, gold production started up worldwide. Every year since 1981, the world has produced more gold than in the year before. Remember, it takes a long time to bring a gold mine on stream. First, somebody's got to decide to look for gold. After he's found it, he has to rustle up the money to open his mine. It takes years to gear up. Now look at the projections and you can see, with the number of mines coming on stream today, that the production of gold is going to continue to go up until at least 2000. More supply. Gold will have its day again, and that day is getting closer, but it'll be based on supply and demand, not hope or mysticism. Prices have been down for 14 years. Ultimately, the process will be reversed, and if given a kick by a currency or inflationary crisis, gold could soar. Some people want to say, no, it's supply, demand, and price. But they have to understand that price is supply and demand. Price describes where supply and demand hang out, the place they meet. Forget the gold fanatics. Forget everything else. Figure out supply and demand, and you'll get extraordinarily rich. It's astonishing how many people cannot grasp this. Finally, the rim and tires came in. The moment of truth for Tabitha and me arrived, the moment I had been dreading. "I wish you wouldn't go," I said. "I want to go and I want to stay," she said. "We'll take it easier," I said. "You want to rest more? We'll rest more." "The roads, Jim. Riding over them is like wrestling with an alligator. It's not fun. They're bound to get better as we move west." "West is a long way off, 4,000 miles. Please," I said. "I'm going to miss you so much." "Let me think about it," she said. We went through the business of getting the tires and the rim. I was excited. I sensed I had a chance with her. "Look, I'll go on some more," she said. "But this doesn't mean I'm going all the way. I may still fly back at some point. This whole trip is still more your dream than mine." "Wonderful," I said. "But remember, if I read this map correctly, there's not an airport for the next 2,000 miles. That gave her pause, and she nodded. But she had made up her mind. She was coming. I felt whole again, relieved, as we set out once more. Chapter 14. Siberia. On the way to Birobidzhan, I dropped my bike 3 times, Tabitha none. She was getting much better now, navigating the mud, potholes, gravel, and boulders in these awful roads with the strength, endurance, and cunning of a pro. Maybe even better than me. I wondered. Was the strength and adaptability of youth trouncing experience and wisdom? To our surprise, Birobidzhan turned out to be the capital of the Jewish Autonomous Region. Back in the 20s, Jews in European Russia were faced with such severe poverty that many wanted to emigrate. To solve this and several other political problems, Stalin declared he would establish a homeland here for Jews, a region that would govern itself. Naturally, making real this age-old dream created worldwide euphoria in Jewish circles. This would be the first homeland for their people in nearly 2,000 years. For more than 100 years, the Russian leadership had wanted to develop Siberia. Stalin searched for a sparsely populated area for this homeland, so there wouldn't be much of a local protest. He chose this far eastern portion of Siberia, 36,000 square kilometers, on the Bira and Bijan rivers. like the Chinese encouraging the Han to move west near the Central Asian republics. Moving the Jews here had the advantage of providing Stalin a human buffer against his traditional enemies, the Japanese. News clips of that era showed joyous Jews arriving from all over the world. The Communist Party and Stalin garnered immense goodwill, which they would sorely need when news of the purge trials hit the Western press. We went to see a member of the National Parliament from the region, Leonid Skolnick, the equivalent of a United States congressman, who was in fact Jewish. Yes, Leonid confirmed, Jews had moved here from around the world, including France and Italy, but few had stayed. Unfortunately for the new arrivals, this part of Siberia had been full of swamps and bugs, the soil poor, and the winter temperatures would go down to -10 to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Not only had building a life on this frontier been an agonizing experience, but the communist system hadn't worked. He thought the region's 11,000 remaining Jews accounted for about 5% of its population. To my surprise, remembering how much anti-Semitism there was in the Soviet Union, everybody we ran into here with any power was Jewish, as if arriving all those years ago had enabled them to become well established. Leonid said everybody in power was elected. He, too, was a member of the Communist Party, but as it happened, he was resigning from the party this very day. He explained, "The party has lost its link with the people. We have to rebuild the Soviet Union on a new political, social, and economic basis." There might be anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, but Leonid certainly wasn't hiding the fact that he was Jewish, not with a flag displaying the Star of David hanging right there in his apartment. Just as in the Muslim areas through which we passed, a religious revival was going on here. People were going to the synagogue more. They had started a pedagogical institute, a Hebrew language school, and a teaching school where the main language being taught was Hebrew. There were Hebrew summer camps. To my amazement, in these hard times, Moscow was budgeting a huge amount of money, millions of rubles, to build that teaching institute, to aid the revival of Jewish culture. I figured the Soviets had several motives in spending so much: to stop the brain drain westward, to give themselves good press, and to build up the population here. In spite of this, and a proposed increase in the housing stock, Leonid said many Jews were leaving for Israel. We reached Oblukya at midnight, which wasn't as bad as it sounds, because during the southern Siberian summer, daylight lasts until 11 o'clock. The hotel had a dozen rooms. We paid $2 for ours, the foreign traveler's rate, and 10 times what the Russians paid. At the black market exchange rate, the cost to us was $1. I continue to be amazed that the Russians never changed a price. We might have been in a slum. This building had been built 20 years before, but it had gone downhill so far it might have been built 100 years before and never maintained. We had a sitting room, a small bedroom, and a bathroom with the standard Western appliances, but no water. As in the Central Asian republics, in this and the other Siberian hotels, the beds were unmade, the bed linens folded at the foot of the bed. Naturally, since there were no other travelers, there was no restaurant or food. Tonight we cooked our meal, the vegetables, bread, and cans of meat we carried with us, in the kitchen downstairs. I love to sample the nightlife wherever I travel, but the nightlife here was watching the stars. The next day, the roads, gravel, dust, and loose dirt, immensely difficult to bike through, were so broken up and muddy it took us 8 hours to travel 130 miles. While Tabitha still hated the roads, she was definitely getting better at handling her bike. "I've gone from fear and dread to anger," she told me with a grim smile. "I take the mud wallows and gravel as a personal affront and attack them with a vengeance." I was proud and a little in awe of her. This was on-the-job training in becoming a world-class motorcyclist. I was witnessing a true transformation of spirit, someone coming into her own through willpower and discipline. The maps were certainly right. There were few paved roads in eastern Siberia. It reminded me of the Yukon, which when I passed through it years before contained only 21,000 people in a territory the size of California and New York State combined. This was the Russian frontier, I decided, the wild land that had yet to be tamed. Back in the Alabama of my youth, a familiar feature of the countryside was a county road scraper maintaining the gravel roads. If your stretch of road became too muddy or rut-riven, you called up the commissioner, whom you knew personally, and got him to send over a scraper. Here, nobody took care of the public roads. In winter, they put sand and gravel on the ice, and in the spring, after the ice melted, the sand and gravel fell onto the road, 4 and 5 inches thick. This loose sand and gravel slid out from under our wheels, tossing us into gentle, yet still unsettling spills. We sometimes took the outside of the curve, but that threw us into the path of oncoming traffic. Fortunately, there wasn't much traffic, maybe 30 short-haul trucks in a day, almost no cars. The more towns through which we passed, the easier it was to see why no one traveled. Usarisk had no more goods than Spask Dalny, which had none at all, nor had Aunt Millie left Svobodny for a better job in Shemanovsk. In addition, people thought too much of their cars to drive them out here. Only knuckleheads like us went any distance on this road. When a sensible Russian wanted to go 1,000 miles, he took the Trans-Siberian Railway. The sights around us, however, always lifted our spirits. The skies and clouds were amazing, much like the big sky country of Montana and the Yukon, and yet in some strange way even larger. The enormous billowing clouds were like none I'd ever seen in shape, color, and texture. Why any one bowl of sky should seem larger than another was a mystery to us, but here the heavens felt vaster than any others under which I'd ever traveled. Broad plains of flowers often stretched away from us, irises and lilies and daisies and phlox, purple, yellow, red, white, blue, every conceivable color, fields covered with them. Nobody owned any of it. It was all wild. Ghostly mist rose as the sun set, and the mountain streams meandered down to warmer levels. Hills ascended to our right and left, 1,000 or 2,000 feet high, covered with birch trees and flowers. Sometimes we were treated to vast, jagged flashes of lightning, gorgeous, chaotic latticeworks of crisscrossing bolts, filling entire regions of the sky with disorganized and frenzied electric webs, the power roaring and crackling overhead. The few hotel restaurants out here, never more than one to a town, that would be competitive and wasteful, nearly always had a live band that played so loud no one could talk. We were always hard-pressed to get a table because the locals reserved spaces weeks ahead to celebrate birthdays and anniversaries. Most of the people on the dance floor were women, and nobody seemed to be having any fun. This summer the lambada was 2 or 3 years out of fashion in the West, but in Siberia it was hot. In every hotel restaurant they played it along with the same 3 or 4 other songs, and that was all. Everywhere the same music, as if some central music committee in Moscow had decreed what had to be played this summer in hotel restaurants. If there was alcohol, it was almost always vodka. To our astonishment, one night we were served dry Hungarian red wine. We still went into the kitchens to see what was available. Usually it was tomatoes, cucumbers, cabbage, potatoes, rice, and dumplings in a soup with a crust on the top, and one kind of meat. Always such big kitchens, and so few choices. As we traveled along the Amur River, which separated China from Siberia, we often saw barbed wire on both sides and armed guards facing each other across a few hundred yards. Here we were, next to the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which the Tsars foolishly had built too close to China, creating a security risk. In Blagoveshchensk, an industrial city and a regional capital, we learned that every day a boat came across from China with Chinese merchants and traders, and the Russians went over there to sell goods to the Chinese. The Chinese brought over cosmetics, clothes, and textiles. All I could figure the Russians had of value to trade were timber and vodka, as there was a Stolichnaya vodka factory here. Certainly no sensible Chinese wanted the collapsing ruble. This vodka was manufactured for export, we learned. Citizens could obtain vodka only from state stores, and they were allowed only 2 coupons a month with which to buy 2 bottles, which meant it was in severe shortage. We weren't allowed to buy alcohol in the state stores. I found the story of Blagoveshchensk fascinating, as the city had belonged to both sides during its long history. Founded in 1644 as a military outpost by the Cossacks, it was taken by the Manchurians in 1689. In 1856, the Cossacks recaptured the city. Then, in 1900, to avenge the European deaths in the Chinese Boxer Rebellion, the Cossacks killed every Chinese in the city, thousands of them. And yet, despite this bloody history, trade flourished between the two peoples. To our amazement, in the vodka factory we found North Korean workers, and on a state farm, Chinese laborers who lived in bunkhouses. In another factory, Vietnamese girls in their late teens and early 20s spun cotton into cloth. When I thought about it, it made sense. The Soviets out here had little labor, so they imported it. We met the head man of the textile factory, a Vietnamese called Mr. Trang. We dodged around the subject of our war with his country, but Mr. Trang dismissed the entire thing as of no importance. The women, he said, brought up big containers of goods from Vietnam, shirts, blouses, matches, cigarettes, and canned fruit, which they sold on the Soviet market, making their trip even more profitable. At Muchino, the transcontinental road became a couple of meager trails through grass. We drove along them gamely, but finally even they ended in a gigantic swamp. There was no road west, and the locals avowed there had never been one. The only way across the vast swamp was the Trans-Siberian Railroad. We had to backtrack 50 miles to the last station to ask the station master for help. For the equivalent of $25, he sold us the right to ride a freight train westward, to have a 9 by 44-foot flat car to ourselves. "What about food?" Tabitha asked. "Water?" "He says we'll only be on it a few hours." The yardmen helped us load and tie down the bikes. We had the last car on a 70-car freight train. What a hoot. We were glad the road had ended. Hopping a flat car is to railroading what motorcycling is to motoring, roughing it. The rail yard crews and the scattered crossings through which we passed were stunned to see Westerners and motorcycles on a flat car. Tabitha was glad for the respite, and I too chuckled with delight. The wind blew in our hair, the breathtaking Siberian forests, fields, and hills sailed by, and the clouds presented their dazzling aerial stunts. This glorious ride could never happen at any price in the United States. Everybody connected with sanitation, food, unions, they'd all go berserk. The insurance company would have put us in jail, but there was no road in this part of Siberia, so here we were. There was also no conductor to come through and say the next stop is Trenton, or that we'd be stopping here in Vostok for 20 minutes. We'd dash off at stops to relieve ourselves behind bushes, hoping to scramble aboard before the train pulled out. Usually we had to wait 2 hours for it to leave. Freight trains passed every 15 minutes, carrying everything imaginable, often duplicating what was going the other way. Logs passed going east, yet we saw logs of the same type heading west. We were on the flat car longer than the station master's few hours. Night came. We were forced to buy potatoes, blueberries, onions, and bread from the babushkas who met the train to earn a few kopecks, the only vendors at stations. We had a bottle of vodka to wash down dinner. Occasionally it rained, but nothing our slickers couldn't handle. At night we rolled up in our tiny Japanese sleeping bags and went to sleep. Dawn arrived and we made tea on our butane stove. Another day and another night. We were told there was something of a road near Chernyshevsk, so at last we asked to be put off, having been on our personal flat car for a little more than 2 days. In this part of Siberia, we often passed mobile missile launchers on the highways, scuds, I suppose, and we saw hundreds of tanks. The launchers were 50, 60 feet high, often broken down. This was due north of Beijing, so if war with the Chinese started, here was where there would be action. At a big tank training base, a young soldier, to cement international Soviet-American relations, gave us a reproduction of a sketch, drawn in the heroic mode, of a youthful Brezhnev as a stalwart tank commander. The soldier had won it in a bicycle race. He didn't think much of it as a prize, but I was glad to have it. It now hangs over my pool table. All those gigantic numbers about Soviet military hardware at the CIA and the Pentagon pumped out to justify their own spending. And here we passed missiles, launchers, and military equipment rusting by the side of the road and being fiddled with by half-assed mechanics. Much of these had been stripped for spare parts. A glance told you a lot of them wouldn't work. Having seen both armies, the Chinese and the Soviet, I had the impression that neither side had very much, and that what it did have wasn't very useful. Granted, I hadn't seen as much on the Chinese side. On every bridge out here, this was a war zone, remember, stood a guardhouse and a couple of armed soldiers. What the Chinese did have was all the soldiers in the world. In a war, the Chinese would first take out the Trans-Siberian Railroad, cutting the vast Soviet Union into any number of helpless parts. That afternoon, we were on the road to Chita, a big city, where we hoped to stop and rest after the jolts of the flat car. A police car stopped to ask who the hell we were and what we were doing out here, just as the Alabama patrolmen might stop and check out strangers. After we showed them our papers, they pointed to the sky and said in pidgin English that we'd better find Skelter because there was going to be a sturm. I thanked them and they left. "What's a sturm?" Tabitha asked. "I guess a storm?" "Maybe we should pull over," said Tabitha. "Wait it out." Although it had rained here for 6 days, today it was dry. "I've seen storms before," I said. "We were on that flat car too long. I want to spend the night in Chita, where we have the chance of a decent hotel room, not another night in a drafty barn." At 5 o'clock, we drove through a picturesque village where we saw no one, not a soul. It was so unusual and so eerie that the hairs on the back of my neck rose. Outside the village, it became ominously black and still. We kept moving. I thought about stopping, but I figured a little unpleasantness from a storm would be more than made up for by getting to Chita and some form of civilization. If you stopped in Siberia every time it rained, you'd never make it across. Then, a gust of wind hit the side of the bikes, and I thought it would knock me over. The wind got wild quickly, rushing at us from all sides. No sooner had I figured out how to tack into it than it changed direction, whipping my bike around. In front of me, Tabitha was having trouble too. It started to rain, buckets of lashing water, which turned into hail. Ice stones the size of mothballs and golf balls racketed against our helmets, face shields, and fenders. The protection of leather jackets, heavy sweaters, and shirts wasn't enough. Our backs were pummeled as painfully as if buckets of stones were being hurled from the sky. We were in a maelstrom of wind, rain, and ice stones. Within minutes, the slippery road became a river of white hail and water, making the bikes even more difficult to keep upright. Fields ran up to the road on both sides. There was no shelter. The wind rose and howled as if it wanted to sweep us up and blow us away. We clung to our handlebars and fought to hold the 500-pound bikes upright. We passed 20 white and tan cows in the middle of the road, and yet the sky was so black and the hail so thick we could scarcely see them. Our wheels slid about, and only our boots kept us upright. We were creeping along at 4 or 5 miles an hour when a cow, blinded by the storm, walked into me. My bike was knocked over, and I was sprawled across the road. Tabitha put her kickstand down and ran back to help, slipping and sliding on the mud and white balls underfoot. She helped me right my bike. I should have listened to that policeman, and I should have stopped in that village. Here, my impatience, my drive to move along had put us in danger. Anything could happen out here. The road could wash out, a flash flood could overwhelm us, a blind truck could run over us. She was terrified, in tears and in pain. The hail! It hurts! I can't see anything!" "What do you want to do?" I shouted. "Where do you want to stop?" She didn't know. She shouted that she was worried about our bike. Didn't hail destroy cars? I shouted that we had to keep moving to get out of this. There wasn't any sense standing here and letting the storm beat up on us. I've never been one to stand still. If we left our bikes there in the middle of the road and walked somewhere, who knew what would happen to them, or to us? We cranked the bikes up, put them into the lowest gear, and still blinded by hail, hugged the edge of the road and pushed them along. Even that was hard, because we had to peer through the gloom and the hail to make sure we were still on the road. It was hard to keep our footing with hailstones underfoot. We pushed the bikes for a long while. Finally, the storm lifted and the sky turned light again. Under the summer heat, the hail melted. We had never had a chance to put on our rain suits. We were soaked, and so were our saddlebags and almost everything in them. In the middle of the road, Tabitha stripped down to her underwear and put on her rain suit, the only dry clothes she could find. On every side, the landscape was windswept and beaten down. Tons of water rushed down the sides of the hills and roads. Stones the size of footballs and grapefruit had been blown out onto the unpaved road. Branches, leaves, and trees were strewn across the road. In places, the road bed was washed away. "Maybe Sturm means tornado in Russian," said Tabitha. "Something might have been lost in translation," I said. "The next time the police announce a Sturm, we're stopping." "Right," was all I could answer. In a small town, parts of which were under a foot of water, we tried to get gas, but the electricity was out, which meant the pumps wouldn't work. One of the locals sold us gas from his spare jerry can. Now the sky looked fine, so we again set out for Chita, this time with some of the local fellows in cars as companions, because we were always exciting to the Russians who stumbled across us. They led us out of town. One dashed ahead and came back with the news that the storm had washed out the bridge. We figured this now was the end of the day. No, they said. "We'll show you something else." We went back to the fork in the road with them and took the other way. After a couple of miles, we came upon a paved road. Unbelievable. Glorious asphalt. Not a road sign, not a car, not a man-made object. Only flat paved road. We roared out. Our new friends rode along, waving and shouting like teenage boys. Well, I was happy. It was late in the day. We were driving straight into the sun. I was wet from the Sturm, but we were making great time. I had on my electric vest and my heated handle grips, trying to dry myself off. My stereo was blasting, first Willie Nelson's On the Road Again, and then Mozart's Eine kleine Nachtmusik. We ran into another fabulous Siberian light show, latticeworks of lightning flashes to the left and sunset colors the like of which I'd never seen to the right. I couldn't think of any place in the world I'd rather be, or anything else I'd rather be doing. I was having a wonderful time, but I kept asking myself, what's this road doing out here? Why isn't it on any of the maps? Finally, the Russians wanted to go back. They explained that this was a secret military road, one used for the transportation of missiles. Of course it was flat and fast. Of course it wasn't on the maps. We said goodbye. With some trepidation, we moved on toward Chita. The entire way there, we encountered no one. We arrived in Chita near midnight, found a decent room, and collapsed into bed. At first, Tabitha was too wound up, tired, and sore to sleep, but finally she dropped off. We had the best night's sleep we'd had in days. The Hotel Siberia in Petrovsk-Zabelkowski, yet another hotel in yet another town where nothing worked. The light fixtures didn't work, nor did the elevators. We considered ourselves lucky to get a bathroom that worked, as out here, lots didn't. As usual, the tub and the sink were fed from a single faucet that swung between them, an economic installation. There were long, dark corridors, unpainted, run down and seedy. If there hadn't been somebody at the desk, I'd have thought this dump was an abandoned slum, the hotel from the graveyard, yet it had been built only 11 years before we'd arrived. I couldn't figure out how the Russians did it, but we constantly ran into public buildings like this, almost new and transformed into an instant slum. After 4 or 5 drunks accosted us in the streets, we realized people all over town were drunk. The officer at the police station where we stored the bikes explained, 2 weeks ago the town ran out of vodka. Our boxcar came in today with our shipment, so everybody bought all he could and got drunk. Back at the hotel, a ruddy-faced, jovial Russian in his 70s introduced himself as Nikolai. Normally he shut down the hotel's boilers at 10 o'clock, he said, but tonight he would leave them on till 11 so we could bathe. He drew us aside. I was stationed with your army in the Great Patriotic War, Nikolai said in a conspiratorial whisper. In contrast to the usual fractured English we encountered, his was fluent. In Belgium. You know Hershey bars? Ford's? Clutching my hand, he glanced around furtively. I've never told any of them. Keep it quiet. They'll put me in a camp if I say good things about Americans. It doesn't matter anymore, I said. All that's changed. His face darkened and he put a finger to his lips. It's changed before. With tears in his eyes, Nikolai told us stories of his wartime adventures with American troops, for whom he was filled with admiration. For 40 years he had treasured these memories, but fearful of the concentration camps that might follow his saying that Americans were good, he had shared none of them with his countrymen. The next morning we asked if we could take his picture, but he refused, saying they might take it from us and use it against him in court. Banned by the communists for decades, town markets had sprung up in many of the villages through which we passed. However, in Siberia, there were still no roadside restaurants, no Howard Johnson's, Dairy Queens, or McDonald's to stop in for a snack. Travelers carried their own food or did without. We bought bread from the bakeries and in these emerging markets stocked up on vegetables and fruit. Often we found potatoes, onions, tomatoes, scallions, cucumbers, yogurt, raspberries, and a delicious fermented blueberry preserve. In contrast to the decrepit public buildings, we rode through villages that looked as if they'd stepped out of picture books. Every house was brightly painted and decorated with Victorian gingerbread, and each had its own well. Carved shutters and intricately designed latticework around the roofs showed how much their owners cared. Flower beds glowed in front, and huge vegetable gardens lay out back, many with greenhouses. Each house was unique and cheerful, and each strove to outshine its neighbors. Nearly all the houses had blue and white or green and white shutters with picturesque designs, as did the gates to the yards and cemeteries. Reflecting layers of Russian history, some graves were marked with the double cross, its top bar aslant, the symbol of the older religion. Some were marked by the cross that stood for the later Russian Orthodox faith. Others had the red star, emblem of communism and atheism. Seeing these self-sufficient villages, I realized the Siberians were never going to starve. Russians might starve in Moscow, they might starve in Leningrad, but not here. These people had lived this way for hundreds of years without the communists bringing them any food. After all, in none of these villages was there a single store. Except for the aid of an occasional telegraph office and train station, the villagers were completely self-sufficient. We stopped in a couple of villages to find out who these people were and what this was all about, because their houses were in such contrast to the grim cities, where everybody lived in big apartment buildings that were allowed to fall apart. The villagers always pressed vegetables on us. Occasionally they gave us meat, too, which always turned out to be as tough as a 10-year-old cow, which it probably was. Inside, these houses were clean, whitewashed, and neat. Not much furniture, but they all had a TV. There wasn't much programming. I noticed Mexican soap operas and the news, but I wondered how they got a signal at all. Then I remembered that Russians were good with military satellite technology. Here was a country in which little except the Trans-Siberian Railroad and the telegraph system worked. And television. It suited their propaganda purposes, I supposed, to keep the people of one mind about whatever their bosses wanted them to be of one mind about. Chapter 15. Ulan-Ude, Zima, and Kansk. For 70 years, the Communists had banned the Buryat Mongols' annual festival, the great gathering of the clans that had been a glorious rite for centuries. These were the descendants of Genghis Khan, proud mountain people who reveled in this religious and nationalistic festival. This year, they didn't ask Moscow if they could put it on, they just did it. More and more, Tabitha and I kept noting examples of the Communists losing their grip over their subjects. The opening ceremonies in Ulan-Ude, the capital of the Buryat Autonomous Republic, was held on a Saturday night. 4 bonfires were lit at the corners of a huge field, symbolizing the 4 corners of the earth and the 4 directions from which the clans had come. As a large crowd of Mongols watched, a trumpet was blown and another bonfire was lit at the field's center. Drums banging, the clans from the traditional homelands marched in, clans from the east, west, north, and south, including the nation-state of Mongolia, each displaying its characteristic red, gold, green, and purple dress. Girls from the west skipped in and danced, then those from the south. Drums beat, flutes piped, dancers swirled in tights and tunics, none in Communist Party gray. Lit by bonfires, this went on till midnight, an hour past sunset. On Sunday came exhibitions and contests in archery, hammer throwing, wrestling, and weightlifting, as well as horse and trotter races, enough events to take up the entire day. A lottery was held for consumer goods, such as refrigerators and washing machines. The climax of the festival was a 1,000-ruble prize, or $160, for anyone who could ride an unbroken horse around a track. The officials cleared the field of spectators, grimly forcing the crowd behind fences. The first Mongol bronco buster stripped off his shirt and danced around the wild horse. The police drew their guns, for this beast might do anything to the rider, or the crowd. This killer horse had been tied to a stake all day. He had become tangled in his ropes, but nobody dared untangle him, afraid of being kicked to death. Yet the Mongol horse was in no mood to cooperate. Instead of giving us fireworks, the exhausted animal walked the shirtless rider around the track. The crowd sank back in disappointment, cheated out of a display of Mongol daring. Outside Ulan-Ude, we toured the beautiful Buddhist temple and monastery, built in 1975 to replace one that had burned. In all the Soviet Union, this was the only surviving Buddhist temple. With its exotic prayer wheels and drums, it made what was happening in the Soviet Union sink in yet deeper. The revival of Judaism in Birobidzhan, the blossoming of Islam in the Central Asian republics, and the resurgence of Christianity everywhere along our path made it clear how far communism, as a faith, had failed. Across the entire Soviet Union, people were spiritually bereft and grasping for something to believe in, a faith to clasp. Desperate for a collective identity, something we all need, this was frequently either their religion or their ethnic group, and often the two fused together. Had the Communist Party developed a successful economic theory, one that produced true wealth, these drives back to ethnic roots would not exist. Create a true boom, and everybody wants to join you. Back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, those who had immigrated to the States wanted to be Americans above all else. They insisted that their children learn English, the faster the better. It is no accident that by the 90s our immigrants are clinging to their roots and that the demand for bilingual education has exploded. Multiculturalism is a force in America as in the Soviet Union because our immigrants no longer feel it's as easy to rise to the top. The decline in our currency and the stagnation of real wages is making being an American less alluring. A reverse example is Poznan, once the summer home of the Prussian kings, but given to Poland after both world wars. Under communist rule, no one in the city had claimed to be or admitted to being German. Now, however, to take advantage of the rise of German prosperity, 40% of these Poles can prove that they are Germans, we were told, and thus must be allowed into Germany. I began to believe that the concept of the giant nation-state, the great melting pot, as economically sound, was diminishing across the world. The British Empire had collapsed, The Chinese were ignoring their central command, and the Russian Empire was falling down around me. I wondered if the American Republic, overburdened by the heavy machinery of its federal government and spiraling debt problems, was destined to lose some of its parts too. As a single example that could be multiplied by the thousands, since 1932, the number of Department of Agriculture bureaucrats per American farmer has multiplied by 16 times. There are two major forces at work as the world moves into the 21st century: globalism and tribal control. How these opposing forces resolve their contradictions will be one of the new century's great historical dramas. The truth is, people need the psychic glue of deeply held beliefs to bind them to others. That we all drink Coca-Cola and eat McDonald's hamburgers is not good enough. We have a powerful need for a strong local identity, one we can comprehend and control, something close to home that we think we can reach out and touch. We resent its being destroyed by globalization and gigantism. We met our first political protesters, two hunger strikers, camping out in the main park in Irkutsk. They sat on a bench surrounded by posters that detailed their stories. One had lost her job at a drama institute. The other person was a dedicated human rights advocate trying to obtain the release of an electrician jailed for accusing his boss of embezzlement. He had been in the park for 6 days. That both were being ignored by the authorities was a major step forward for the people. A year before, they would have been arrested the first day they had shown up. We approached the town of Zima on a dirt road made slippery by a slick coating of thin, watery mud. The rain was wearing us both down. Although we drove cautiously, I took a spill. I wasn't hurt, but one of my saddlebags was ruined, and much of my gear was spread behind me along the muddy road. I gathered up my mud-streaked maps, shirts, toothbrush, and socks. Muttering to myself, I spent a couple of hours scrubbing mud out of them in the bathroom of the sports complex where we were staying. Many cities in China and Siberia had one such center where all athletic contests were held. There were always locker rooms and guest rooms for visiting teams. We learned that Zima means cold. I couldn't imagine what this town in the middle of Siberia called cold must be like in the winter. Here we met Remus Yukus, a visiting Lithuanian about 25 years old, and his first cousin. Remus's uncle had been exiled to Siberia in 1948 by Stalin when he had refused to turn his farm into a cooperative. 3 years after the uncle had arrived, while working as a woodcutter here in the Lithuanian community, a tree had fallen on him and killed him. He had been buried in a local cemetery for 39 years. For a long time, Remus's parents had talked about the tragedy of his uncle's being buried so far from home. Remus finally had been told by his mother, "Go to Zima and get my brother." So, a little bewildered by the strangeness of Siberia, Remus and his cousin had traveled thousands of miles with a small copper-covered, lead-lined locker to find his uncle's grave and bring the bones back to Lithuania for his mother. They had found the grave in a cemetery near a settlement of Lithuanians, marked by his name, the single word Rendys, on a large traditional cross. The ancient gravekeeper said he had known the uncle and verified that this indeed was his grave. The youth's initial excitement had turned to frustration on encountering the Soviet bureaucracy. No local official wanted to give them permission to remove the remains. Each had thrown up objections, handing them more forms to fill out, citing further permissions needed before his department would issue a permit. Remus had visions of returning to Lithuania empty-handed, disappointing his mother. For more than a week, the two had trudged from one government office to another in this small town, documenting who they were, who was buried in their uncle's grave, that the body was indeed that of a relative, and that their uncle had not died of a disease too frightful to unearth. Finally, however, Remus had everything he needed. The two young men were excited and apprehensive at the prospect of opening up a 39-year-old grave. As they dug, it began to rain. At the bottom of the grave, the shovels struck old wood. The remnants of a pine box and a suit of clothes were brought into the light of this sodden day. They tossed the bones out one by one and put them in the lead-lined box for their uncle's long ride home. Before they left, they used a rusty nail to scratch onto the huge sagging cross in Lithuanian, "Gone home." In most towns, there was a gas station that sold the only two qualities of gas available in the Soviet Union, 74 and 93 octane. Most drivers looking to save a few kopecks changed the compression on their cars to burn 74, although over time this ruined their engines. Gasoline cost us the equivalent of 6 cents a liter, or 25 cents a gallon at the official ruble-dollar rate. Of course, at the black market rate it was half that, 12 cents a gallon. In Siberia, we always went to gas stations for gas. When they didn't have 93 octane, we went to the police station and asked for it. They either had it on hand or could get it from the military. At one gas station, Olga, the lady attendant, said in broken English, "Look, I only can sell 93 to police or ambulance drivers." "Yes, but we have to have 93, I said, pointing at the 74 sign and crossing my two index fingers. In Russia, this all-purpose gesture means "niet," I can't do it, no way, or broken. I went on to lay my usual rap on her in sign language and simple English, using the map of the world to show our journey. Hoping she could follow me, I said we had legitimate visas and that we had to have the right gas for these bikes or stay here forever. Olga was firm. "I tell you it is law. I no give good gas to nobody but police and ambulance drivers." "I know we're an inconvenience," I said, "but our bikes must have 93 octane. By the way, do you like Western cigarettes? We don't need this carton of Marlboros." Now Olga was adamant. "Don't you listen?" she shouted, drawing herself up to her full formidable height. "Don't you hear? I tell you 2 times already. I no give good gas to nobody except police, ambulance drivers, and American travelers driving motorcycles." More stretches of bad road. Little pavement, of course, mostly loose gravel, deep ruts, and potholes. We started off fresh each day, thrilling to the scenery and life in the remote villages through which we passed. But by the end of an 8 or 10-hour day, our shoulders ached, our legs were cramped, and we longed for a hot shower. No, our butts weren't sore, a question I've been asked 1,000 times. That may happen on horses, but rarely on a motorcycle, no matter how long the trip or rough the road surface. There was a constant struggle to stay focused, although mercifully here the weather was dry. We counted every mile on the speedometer and hoped the end of the bad road was near. When we got to good patches, dry packed dirt, it was a joy to speed up to 30 miles an hour. Each mile gave us a sense of accomplishment, although it also reminded us of how long it had been since the last one had ticked over, how slowly we were going. Despite the hardships, there was no other place that summer I wanted to be. While we pushed ourselves on travel days to make all the time we could, in between we'd rest and absorb our new surroundings, spending days poking around, visiting and exploring. This was travel the way it was done in the centuries before the car, the airplane, and the steamship. I loved the leisurely pace and the sense of personal mobility, as if we were ambling around the world on a horse, seeing, hearing, and smelling everything firsthand. I reveled in the wind in my face and the unobstructed view of fields, mountains, and streams, the beauty of which was often staggering. The honeyed perfume of flowers would be followed by the excited buzz of bees. When we stopped, we heard the warm wind sigh through the trees. It was fun to be out where no one from back home had ever been, meeting villagers who had never before met foreigners and were delighted to see us. I loved their rough faces, harsh like the Siberian weather, but also untainted by too much civilization. We never knew who and what adventure lay right over the hill. It was a thrill to get a close view of what the world was like, to see for myself what was going on globally. To my mind, we were like Europeans meeting the natives of North America hundreds of years ago. As happened to the Americas, Siberia would become open, would be explored, and tamed. We were the precursors of many more like ourselves who would one day arrive. Wherever we stopped in the wilderness, in the much-vaunted taiga, we were attacked by trillions of black flies. For some reason, they didn't bother us as we drove, but once we stopped, they made that rest stop a torment. Where they came from, I never could figure out. What did they do all day when we weren't there? All year? In the towns, restaurants were often covered with flies. Once we saw a manager doing her accounts, oblivious to the dozens of flies on her dress and her books. No Siberian had ever seen a fly swatter. Some entrepreneur could make millions producing them. One morning we pulled over for a break. While I dodged flies, Tabitha explored the lush green field near the road. She called out excitedly, holding up a tangle of green. I went to her. She was standing in a field of green peas that back in the South we called sweet peas. Well, Tabitha loved raw peas, so we pulled up a bunch and sat by the road. We swatted black flies and shelled and ate a mess of them. I was worried about our eating so many raw green vegetables that we'd get sick the way you can after eating green apples, but the peas were delicious and went down well. In other parts of the world, China for example, neither we nor the Chinese would dare eat anything straight from the field because they used human excrement as fertilizer. Nobody in China, not even the Chinese, would drink untreated water. But in Siberia, there were so few people that there was little pollution of vegetables or the water. Afterward, despite the flies, we were so contentedly full that we took a nap. The field of peas was out in the middle of nowhere, far between towns, a field gone wild. We filled a plastic bag and took several bunches. Part of our excitement in finding the peas stemmed from our experience of the Russian diet, which appalled us. For breakfast, they ate every artery-clogging, cholesterol-filled food they could find. A hard-boiled egg or two, a piece of bread covered by a layer of butter as thick as the slice itself, and a glass of smetana, maybe 12 ounces of the stuff, sour cream with the consistency of yogurt. Their other meals were as bad: fatty meat, more bread and butter, fried potatoes, and few vegetables, followed by sweets and cakes. This diet, the general lack of exercise, smoking, and rampant alcoholism combined to shorten lives. The lifespan of Russian men averaged only 64 years. In the United States, the average was 72 years, and in Japan, an even more impressive 75 years. We found more green peas along the road and continued to eat our fill, along with the vegetables and fruit we had bought in town markets. Coming into Kansk at about 10:30, we saw a light show of lightning on one side of the road and a glorious sunset on the other, pinks and yellows like I'd never seen. Then the first end-to-end double rainbow of my life appeared, and I kept staring at it in disbelief. The road here was another disaster, dry but with lots of loose gravel. It took us 10 hours to drive 130 miles. Both of us fell several times. We were going so slowly that these falls weren't dangerous, just frustrating. I tried to take the spills in stride. After all, I'd never expected anybody to pave our way around the world, but Tabitha was disheartened by the endless bad roads. We had been in Siberia several weeks and had covered 3,000 miles. Yet we had another 3,000 or 4,000 miles of doubtless the same bad roads to go. We were discovering the hard way how large indeed was the world's largest country. We approached Krasnoyarsk, a large industrial city closed to foreigners. Its population of nearly 1 million people made it one of Siberia's largest cities and the capital of the huge region that stretched from central Siberia to the Arctic coast. I understood that it was a center of the Soviet defense industry, and that it produced plutonium. It was here in 1989 that the Soviet government had admitted it had a missile tracking radar station in violation of the ABM, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and which it promised to dismantle. Rumor had it that the Russians were building the world's largest underground nuclear waste dump near the city, with part of it to reach under the important Yenisei River. This seemed stupid to me, but I didn't put it past a government that had destroyed the Aral Sea. All this military activity, according to a policeman we asked about the roads, meant we had to go around Krasnoyarsk. Our map showed that the road in and out of the city was good, whereas the northern route around the city was, as usual, unmarked, which meant impossible roads and an extra 2 days and 300 miles at that. I wondered who would stop us if we disobeyed our permits. So far, the soldiers with guns on every bridge only stared in disbelief as we passed. We had been stopped only once in 3,000 miles. "Well, we certainly can't stay in a hotel there," said Tabitha. I agreed. At night, when we would park our bikes at the police station, we only sometimes had to show our visas, but we always had to show them to the suspicious hotel management. "We'll just drive through," I said. "Sure," she said, perking up at the idea of bypassing all the bad roads. "We'll stay at a room on the other side. For a good road, I'll even camp out." I nodded. "No accidents. I don't want the KGB down on us because we're not where we're supposed to be." "No accidents," she echoed with a knowing smile. So we set off on a beautiful paved road toward the closed city of Krasnoyarsk. Shortly, we approached a bridge that was heavily guarded by Russian soldiers. They made me nervous, but I stared straight across my handlebars and pretended I belonged there. Both of us kept our speed steady. To our relief, they only watched us go by. A second bridge came up, again guarded by a patrol of gun-toting soldiers. Again, we stared straight ahead and didn't slacken our speed. I felt their eyes raking us. We drew abreast of them. No one shouted. We passed them. No shots were fired in the air. I didn't dare look back. We'd made it. A few minutes later, we were in downtown Krasnoyarsk. Grim, broad streets, seedy, modern buildings, and scores of people fishing below the big main bridge. Then it hit me. The KGB was in Moscow telling them what to do in Krasnoyarsk, but out here, nobody was listening. This country was disintegrating around us. Chapter 16. Novosibirsk and West. At Kemerovo, where the coal miners had gone on strike in 1989, we met the head of the union and some miners. This was the union that had stunned the USSR with its first strike in decades. Militant, they told us they supported Yeltsin and that they wanted to change the government. They knew they would have to strike to do it. Then we went to see Oleg Glazunova, the head of a new independent newspaper, which was being threatened with closure. An employee translated our conversation. While we were there, in walked an army major, quickly followed by Colonel Solovyov, both from Novosibirsk and intent on getting the paper to be less anti-military. Colonel Solovyov's message to Oleg was that if the paper didn't stop saying rude things about the army, next week there was likely to be a severe paper shortage. Over a picture of tanks coming back from Hungary, the newspaper had asked, "Why are the military sending tanks here, a town that doesn't have room for them? We think it's to suppress the coal miners. We think they're building up the army for the time they can crack down on us." Oleg pointed out the caption to the colonel, who replied, No, that's not the reason. We learned that lesson in Tbilisi. In the future, the army will stay neutral. We're bringing in troops and tanks because we've been thrown out of Europe, and this is the only place they can put us." I was amazed that their discussion was this rational and that we were allowed to hear it. That it was being held at all was progress, because not too many months before, the KGB would have come over and said, "Close the damn paper," or they would have shot Oleg. However, the miners supported its publication. If the army got too heavy-handed, the miners would go on strike. The Soviet Union was one of the world's largest coal-producing countries. All their steel mills, generators, and trains ran on coal. The apartment buildings of the party members in Moscow, not to speak of everybody else, were heated with Siberian coal. Despite the nation's gigantic oil production, coal was what kept Soviet heavy industry going. All hell would pay if the army blundered into shutting down the Siberian coal mines. I wondered if the Soviet workers had wised up about their masters. It seemed such a good deal for the workers that no price ever changed. What worker wanted prices to go up? The communists had a sweet racket. To begin with, they had the world's largest country, 8,650,000 square miles, a sixth of the world's land area, and almost as large as the entire North American continent. While difficult to exploit, Siberia hadn't yet been properly surveyed. Russia was also the world's richest country in energy resources and minerals. The Soviets probably had at least a quarter of the world's oil deposits, 40% of its iron ore, and a third of its phosphates. Even today, no one knows the full extent of the nation's wealth. Pushing hard, the Soviets had come to produce more steel than Japan, more fertilizers than the United States, and more oil than Saudi Arabia. This fervid lunge for producing more and more, however, meant that quality, environmental concerns, and efficient production had been ignored. If Russia produced a lot, the theory went, and kept the price of bread and rent and cigarettes and vodka low, then it would never have to raise wages. The theory was interesting. If the price of gas for the tractors never went up, surely then the price of wheat and thus bread never had to go up. The reason, of course, that communism had survived here as long as it had was that prices went up in the outside world. During the commodities boom of the 70s and 80s, when the Soviets had sold huge amounts of gold, palladium, coal, silver, lumber, natural gas, copper, platinum, and oil to the outside world, they had paid their subservient citizens nothing to drill and mine and plant and harvest. As the price of oil went to $40 during the 1970s, Moscow had reaped a bonanza. All the money had gone to the communist hierarchy and for the space program, to intercontinental ballistic missiles and world-class Olympic teams. The party managed things so poorly, and the system was so rotten, there had been nothing left for the 275 million working toads, except subsistence wages and a subsistence existence. If you counted all the Central European workers slaving under the umbrella of the empire, there had been yet more slaves. Yet why couldn't it have gone on forever? If they hadn't bought anything from the outside, if they'd had a closed system, if they were so smart, why did it collapse? Because the system hadn't been efficient. Because nobody had had any incentive to produce more, sell more, or make a profit. A perfect analogy is the U.S. Post Office, or our state-run educational system. Imagine an entire economy run for 70 years by the U.S. postal system. That was the old Soviet Union. The problem is, the real world keeps intruding. In the real world, real prices are the only mechanism that brings in the right amount of supply. All a government has to do to deal with a shortage is let the price go up. We didn't need gas lines back in the Carter years. All we had to do was let the price of gasoline rise, and oil would have been found under every service station. As the price goes up, people drive less. The price always matches supply and demand. That's what the price is, that matchup. If you run out of copper in a closed system in which the price cannot go up, then nobody has an incentive to go out and find more, unless he's told to. To hell with that, he'll say. I'd rather go to the movies or drink vodka. But if the price of copper does go up, then lots of people say, hey, wait a minute. I can make a lot of money if I go out and find me some copper. Owners start to produce their marginal mines. Those that weren't profitable at 50 cents a pound become extremely profitable at $1.50. Scrap pipe comes out of walls and old car radiators and goes to the smelter. If you had complete abundance of everything, without shortages and dislocations, in theory, I guess a closed system would work. That was always part of the Soviet theory, that we'll have an abundance of everything because we are communists. We plan centrally, our people work hard, and it's a new mankind. Well, the new mankind was certainly one part of that formula they didn't quite swing. People don't change. They haven't for the past 5,000 years I know about, and I have no earthly reason to believe they will anytime soon. One effect of low prices in the Soviet world was constant shortages. Every time the price of oil went up in the great outside world, there was an internal shortage. The communists, however, never told their citizens that they couldn't have gasoline, because they, the communist leaders, were selling it for hard currency in Europe and Africa. As we drove into Novosibirsk, the largest city in Siberia, we were excitedly flagged down by a couple in a fairly new Lada, the basic Soviet car. Igor Kulikov and his wife Valentina introduced themselves in broken English as the only private producers of motorcycle helmets from the Urals to the Pacific, or 3/4 of the Soviet Union. As was true back in the 20s when the United States had been poorer, the Soviet Union had lots of motorcycles. The Kulikovs' customers didn't buy the helmets for safety, but because they looked Western. They made a fashion statement announcing that this motorcyclist was up to the minute and cool. The helmets cost $32 at the official rate, $16 at a black market rate. There was enough of a demand to furnish the couple with an imported Jawa motorcycle, matching yuppie clothes and gold chains. They were the Soviet Union's new entrepreneurs. They were so successful, they even had acquired a second one-bedroom apartment, nearly impossible to obtain in the Soviet Union, which they used as their factory. They insisted we visit them. Their home was furnished with tiles bought on the black market, a washing machine, stove, stereo, and other consumer durables. They brought out black market caviar, wine, and pâté to celebrate our visit. A couple of years before, when it had become legal to produce goods privately and sell them, they had given up their factory jobs to concentrate on helmet production. They'd crafted their helmets from fiberglass, aping the models they'd seen in foreign pictures, and sold them on the black market. Working together at a kitchen table, they'd made 10 times what they could have made in a factory, even though they'd had to give up their profit to the state. This country can't go back, Igor told us. We have to move forward, become like the West. We won't let the old bosses go back to the old ways. The past is dead. We also met their shell-shocked Afghan war neighbor, fat and unemployed. I couldn't help but think that Valentina and Igor represented the future of this country. Their sad, pathetic neighbor, its past. For a few days, Igor and Valentina traveled with us on their bike, wanting to spend time with us and loving the idea of crossing part of their country with Americans. In the poor hotels in which we stayed, rooms rarely had double beds, yet they told us they always woke up in the same bed together, because sometime during the early morning, one of them crept into the bed of the other. They had been married as teenagers, had a child, and after 10 years, they still did everything together, supported each other completely. Romance was clearly still in the relationship. I saw in their marriage something I'd never seen before. I realized such long-term relationships were actually possible. I was very sorry when they turned back. The Hotel Novosibirsk refused us service because the rooms weren't good enough for foreigners. Ha! They should have seen where we'd been. So we stayed at the Hotel Central, which took foreigners but almost refused us too, since the only rooms available weren't good enough for Americans. Ha again. They finally gave us a suite, which was what we usually got in our quest for a minimum standard of comfort. At least the refrigerator worked. A bright banner arching across the street drew our attention. Special events were so rare here it made us stop and ask what was going on. A festival was being held. Everybody would bring his accordion for a combination folk festival and dance. Yes, indeed, we wanted to go. That afternoon, accordion players and dancers gathered on an outdoor stage. We were introduced to Gennady Zavolokin, the folk accordion star, and his wife Svetlana. He had a broad Slavic face, warm and generous. In the Slavic part of the Soviet Union, in Mother Russia, he was very famous, with his own television show and albums. We learned that he, his folk music, and his dances were part of the revival of the Slavic spirit. The accordion spun such soul-captivating Slavic notes that the adoring public gave these festivals a special name, Play Garmonika. He introduced us to the crowd. Tabitha and I danced on the stage with the rest of the celebrants. This seemed to be a combination church festival, country music hoedown, and square dance. Certainly it was a throwback to the days before the Communist Party. Gennady wanted to keep his music separate from politics, but I gathered that the Slav nationalists wanted to conscript his music into their cause. I asked him to define for me the Russian soul. "Ah, fire, stars, talent, joy," he declared, his eyes shining. To him, this festival wasn't political, and yet it was. He was one more manifestation of what we'd seen in so many places in this part of the world, people grasping for an identity that was theirs alone. The Slavs were reaching for their heritage through Gennadi's music and dances, reaching for their traditions the way the Mongols and the Muslims were. We went to our new friend's dacha with their kids, 16-year-old Anastasia and 11-year-old Zahar. What was strange to us was how the dacha was situated. Out here, still 3,000 miles from Moscow and in the very heart of Siberia, there was nothing but vast tracts of unused land in every direction. Yet the government would set aside only 5 acres for the entire town and say, "Okay, you can build all the dachas you want on these 5 acres. So there would be 40 or 50 summer cabins with no running water and no electricity, with tiny yards and tiny gardens, all crowded together on a few acres in the middle of this immense wilderness. We swam in the river Ob and then sweated in their banya, the Russian steam bath. Gennady stoked up the wood stove. Then, after he had heated up some rocks, he threw water on them, creating clouds of steam. We were given a particular type of birch branch, one as fragrant as eucalyptus, with which to lash ourselves. The women and girls undressed in the house, wrapped up in towels, and rushed into the banya. When they couldn't stand it anymore, they came back, and the men went in till we couldn't stand it anymore either. We ate and danced and drank and banya'd till 1 in the morning, having a fine old time. In Novosibirsk, we saw our first really big demonstration. Scores of people gathered around the ubiquitous Lenin statue, demonstrating against the communists. One man protested that he was a war hero, had been decorated several times, and wasn't getting his military pension. There were others with similar gripes. Most of these people were protesting that they wanted more democracy, a better economy, and an end to the life-draining shortages. We went out to a think tank at Akademgorodok, the local university, a gigantic one built by Khrushchev, second largest in the Soviet Union. I was hoping to get a better fix on these enormous changes. I met an English-speaking economist, Svetlana Muradova, who taught courses in capitalism here. We talked about what was happening. The command economy, she said, planned from the top down, had been reasonably effective in the early stages, when the Soviet Union had been trying to leap into the industrial age, but was hopeless now. The country had to move to a market economy. While it was hard to swallow, I remembered that Kiev mathematicians were said to have calculated that to plan in adequate detail just 1 year's industrial production in the Ukrainian Republic alone, the entire world's population would need to be employed for 10 million years. Besides being inefficient, such a command system devolved into bureaucratic delays, shoddy goods, no consumer power, no competition, no innovations, and perpetual shortages. After 70 years of communist teaching and 60 years of planning, Svetlana said, our people expect the state to take care of them. They are used to taking orders, not taking initiative. We can't get it out of our heads that people who get rich, speculators, or people starting a co-op are inherently evil. She sighed. The truth is, the capitalist system works. The communist system doesn't. We have 2 big shocks going on, she further explained. Loss of hard currency income, which led to Gorbachev's twin reforms of glasnost and perestroika. We sell commodities abroad like a third world country, not quality goods like a superpower. With the collapse of oil prices, we have to sell 3 barrels of oil to buy the same German machine tool we used to buy with 1 barrel. I knew their trade amounted to only 2% of the world's total, pitiful for a superpower. They had never had inflation in the Soviet Union, she explained. It was an evil of capitalism that they bypassed because they never raised prices. At a time when a ruble was officially worth 16 cents, 100 kopecks to a ruble, the bus cost 2 or 3 kopecks, less than 1/10 of a penny, and newspapers 2 kopecks. In our money, it cost anywhere from 10 to 80 cents to stay in a hotel room, for the best room in the house. Newspapers were so cheap, people bought them for wrapping paper. In the state store, a bottle of vodka was 10 rubles, $1.50. A tomato was 5 kopecks, 1/10 of a cent or so, if you could find it, whereas on the private market, a pound of tomatoes cost 50 cents. The only thing the state store had lots of was birch juice. The economist said they were only now starting to figure out how to measure inflation. She was baffled by what she saw around her, obviously sensing that events were occurring that were momentous, but not knowing what to do or say about them. "Isn't standing in line a form of inflation?" I asked. "Isn't all that time and energy a tax, one that increases the price of goods?" She shrugged and gave me a weak smile. As if to give myself a living example of the absurdity of their pricing, at a poster store in Novosibirsk, I bought about 100 posters, which weighed more than 15 pounds, for 24 rubles, about $2.50. No wonder there was a paper shortage if posters were this cheap. Then I found a 1991 calendar for 40 cents, with pictures of all the czars on it. The czars! I couldn't believe my eyes. Had glasnost come so far that the former oppressors could be celebrated? Figuring it would be valuable after the Soviet Union fell apart, I bought it too. This was like being down the rabbit hole in Alice in Wonderland. Nothing had a real price. At the post office it cost me 28 rubles, less than $3, to mail these 15 pounds of posters to New York. The babushka there wrapped up my purchases lovingly, but I wondered how they could make it halfway around the world at such an absurd rate. Tabitha was tightening the heads on my bike when she realized the wrench wasn't clicking. It just kept turning. She found that the threads of 2 of the long studs holding my cylinder to the crankcase had become stripped, ending the mystery of the source of the knocks in my engine. She surmised that this had been caused by overheating, compounded by the pummeling the bikes had taken on those bad roads. In addition to my driving this air-cooled engine at such low speeds that it hadn't properly cooled, my large fairing had further boxed in the heat. We couldn't go any farther till these studs were repaired. We asked around, the way you shop for everything in the Soviet Union. Certainly there were no motorcycle dealers. Somebody's kid's history teacher knew somebody at the auto plant. Armed with a sort of introduction, we drove out to the factory, hoping the automotive engineers there would help, as well as have tools. Yes, they would help. Tabitha got into a collaborative process with the workers, and they all tackled the problem. I tried to imagine what would happen in the States if you pulled up to an automobile factory and asked for help with your motorcycle. They said, "Okay, the first thing we'll do is make a part." Someone remembered a Czech truck engine that had metal studs of about the right length, also threaded on both ends. Czech meant quality, they bragged. The stud was larger than we needed, so they had to lathe it down to the proper size. This international crew took a tap and die set, tapped out the holes, and rethreaded them. I hoped they knew what they were doing, since I certainly didn't. To make sure the stud didn't wiggle loose, Tabitha insisted on using a little of the Loctite we'd brought. When completed, the repair was supposed to make the bike as solid as new. However, the auto workers presented us with a couple of extra truck studs in case we had further problems. Chapter 17. Moscow. At long last, we were on the M5, the main road into Moscow. Not only was there more traffic, but here it was faster and more reckless. Our excitement, too, was rising at nearing the capital. Now the traffic guard stations were all manned. Also, there were many more cars than trucks, whereas out in Siberia, it was by far the other way around. Despite this traffic, the vast empty spaces we'd been across made it hard to believe that the Soviet Union was the world's 5th largest producer of cars, turning out 1.3 million a year. Under the 13th five-year plan, the one for the 90s, car production was supposed to double, but I had every doubt that this would happen. Back in the States, there was a diversity of vehicles on the road. Campers, big trucks, little trucks, motorcycles, station wagons, European, Japanese, and American cars. But here, there was only one kind of car and one kind of truck. Oddly enough, the cars looked like small Italian boxcars with no refinements, no padding, no real dashboards, just tiny stripped-down boxes. For 20 years, the Russians had made the same car in the same factories, changing them very little. Our motorcycles had more horsepower, more cubic centimeters to their engines than did these cars. The reason, of course, was that when the Russians said, "We gotta have a car factory," they went around to see who was going to build them a factory and show them how to build cars. The Italians won the bid, partly because at that time the Italian Communist Party was the largest in Europe. Fiat came over and built the car factory for them. In fact, the Russians renamed the town Togliatti after the leader of the Italian Communist Party. So, to this day, the Russians turn out only 60-style Fiats, with the brand name Lada. The closer we came to Moscow, the more ordered and clean became our surroundings. We stopped at a collective farm. Factory workers from Moscow were there harvesting what was supposed to be a bumper crop, their wages paid by their factory. There was an excellent chance, however, that despite the good harvest, half the grain and vegetables wouldn't reach the consumer because of tractors, combines, and trucks that sat idle for lack of spare parts and gas. The factory and office workers who were working the fields told us they thought their coming here was a stupid policy. One engineer said it was a waste of his talents for him to be pulling up carrots. The farm's manager said this year they would again have to import wheat from the United States. He felt private farms and adequate machinery would solve Russia's food problems, even though, yes, this would make some people rich. Poor Lenin. He had led the revolution and made himself into the father of the New World Order for the peasants, and now they thought it was all a mistake. Every farm worker had productive private plots, while the state farms never met their potential. As we pressed on, more and more gas stations were out of gas or limited us to 10 liters each. Because I listened to the BBC shortwave news broadcast nightly, I knew that the Gulf crisis over Iraq's invasion of Kuwait had raised the world price of oil. I was certain the USSR was selling its petroleum products overseas at top dollar to get hard currency, because the Russians assumed it was only another mysterious shortage. Naturally, they didn't know that for years their oil production had been the world's largest. Whenever there's a national problem and the government explains things to its citizens, don't believe the explanation. Figure out where the money trail goes, and you'll almost always know what's going on in the real world. The 150 miles from Ryazan to Moscow were all 4-lane. Despite the crowded roads and their aggressive drivers, we felt wonderful. When we had landed in Siberia 2.5 months before, Moscow had been only a dot on the map. Siberia, a vast expanse of paper. Every day I'd draw a new line on the map, showing what we'd done, and here we were. We'd made it. Both of us were exhilarated, and now we were about to see Moscow itself, the capital of the largest contiguous empire the world had ever known, one larger than that of the Chinese, the Romans, and the Spanish. As someone who had studied history and politics, I could not conceive that anyone would ever again conquer so many square miles, and here we were, charging into its capital on 1,000cc steeds. Had you ridden into Xi'an and Rome and Samarkand at their heights, you would have found rich people and unparalleled luxury. Moscow should have been the richest city in the world, but it was a place where you couldn't buy a carton of cigarettes without a riot. You couldn't get a bottle of vodka. You couldn't get soap. You couldn't get toilet seats. You couldn't get anything. Even though Moscow dominated this gigantic empire of hundreds of millions of people, what we were driving into was a large, poor city, a city of the third world. It was huge. There were big buildings and wide roads the way you'd expect at the seat of a powerful empire, but there was no vibrancy, no texture, no depth. This was a bland, dismal city, a gray monument to a dying faith, a city without a soul. Odder still was the fact that since the days of the Tsars, Moscow has never had much. Moscow was the richest city in the Soviet Empire, yet Birmingham, Alabama had more. Harlem had more of the everyday necessities of life, available to anyone who simply walked into a store. African cities often had more to offer in terms of luxury goods, even regular stuff like toothpaste, shoes, beer, a shirt, a pair of socks. Here, even if you had money, little was available at any price. Tabitha was from the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and she lives about 4 blocks from where she grew up. She loves cities. After 2.5 months of Siberian wilderness, she was ready for a city, a big city. Back in New York, she loved to walk and observe street life, the Souvlakia man, and the different shops, and the West Africans selling fake designer watches on Broadway, and the incredible variety of people, everything that makes New York streets vital. When we came into a wonderful city, she always made time to take long walks. She would plan strolling tours along the city's most famous streets, viewing them as urbanologist W.H. White did, as rivers to be swum and played in. The first time she was in London, she had walked 8 or 9 hours and had been exhilarated by her tramp. So, on 2 different days, she went walking in Moscow, every minute expecting it to become interesting. If you started walking in Paris at the far end of the Champs-Élysées, it might be boring, but the closer you got to the Arc de Triomphe, the more interesting street life would become. As she walked along Moscow streets, Ulitsa Gertsena, Pushkinskaya Ulitsa, Kibasheva Ulitsa, she kept thinking, any minute now, it's going to start happening. She tramped about Moscow for 4 or 5 hours at a stretch, and it never became interesting. The city's continual gray sameness was oppressive. On the street there was no life, no vitality. Nothing seemed to be going on. Along Broadway back in New York there were always deliveries being made. She told me that night that she couldn't remember seeing even one. There were few shops, maybe 2 every 3 or 4 blocks, one of which was likely to be a bakery. By the end of Tabitha's Moscow walks she was exhausted, not exhilarated, downtrodden, not stimulated. We had heard of Suzdal, the legendary town outside the capital that 1,000 years before had been larger than Moscow, but nothing prepared us for its score of ancient churches. If Tamerlane's mosques in Samarkand and the Emperor Chin's terracotta armies will provide Uzbekistan and Xi'an with tourist dollars for decades to come, so Suzdal and environs will bring visitors by the tens of millions to Russia. Over our entire journey of 7,000 miles across the Soviet Union, we had not seen more than a dozen architecturally significant buildings. Out in the hinterlands, the ancient churches were crumbling from disuse. Many had been destroyed or converted for other uses. Often the glorious onion domes had been dismantled and replaced by flat roofs. Here in the Suzdal area, a few miles from Moscow, were dozens of ancient monasteries, museums, convents, and churches, many lovingly preserved on a green country plain. Set in what was originally a fertile wheat-growing area, Suzdal became a center for monasteries after it came under Moscow's rule in 1392. Later, in the 17th and 18th centuries, rich Moscow merchants had displayed their Russian Orthodox spirituality by putting up little churches in Suzdal, sometimes one for summer and one for winter, each merchant striving to outdo the last in pious splendor. I was amazed that the communists hadn't razed them all. Maybe because the town was small, nobody had ever thought of turning these religious gems into apartment houses for state workers. Maybe the churches had never been torn down to make way for industrial progress, because the Moscow-Nizhny Novgorod Railroad passed by 20 miles to the south. Anyway, luckily for the world, to this day the area has kept its glorious religious buildings and its rural charm, foregoing air pollution, big city noise, and ugly modern buildings. The most magnificent church was called, oddly enough, the Kremlin, or Fort. Building was started in the 12th century and completed in the 18th. An enormous onion dome, cobalt blue with gold stars and topped by a cross, was surrounded by 4 miniature replicas of itself, all 5 towering over scalloped gables and whitewashed stone. The Nativity Chapel was filled with brightly lit gold panels of late 17th century icons. Many were painted in a combination of Byzantine and Russian Orthodox styles. Suzdal didn't only have magnificence, however. The wooden church of St. Nicholas, brought here from the village of Glotovo, held no more than 20 worshippers, but brought home the importance of religion to 18th century Russian villagers. The churches might have been built by rich merchants in a vain display of spiritual worthiness, but the quiet buildings, the long arched walkways, and the faultless skies had a calming effect on us. Nothing we'd seen so far in the Soviet Union had been as remarkable. To our amazement, one of the churches had a plaque that said it belonged to the Russian Orthodox Synod in New York. I was stunned. The New York Synod had been founded by White Russians, czarists fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution. In Red Square, I thought, Lenin must be whirling in his glass coffin over the fact that a local church had pledged allegiance to his worst enemy. Inquiring how this could be, we met Father Valentin, the church's spiritual leader. Several months back, he said, he had been asked by the KGB and the Bishop of Moscow to spy on foreign visitors. He had refused and was transferred to another church, one out in the boondocks. His parishioners made such a fuss over his departure, however, that he was brought back. Yet a proviso was added to his return, that the renegade church couldn't be part of the local synod, punishing its parishioners and Father Valentin alike. He wrote New York and asked permission to join the synod outside of Russia, which was granted, which is how the synod on 93rd Street in Manhattan has a branch in Suzdal. In Moscow, we visited Maxim Kruglova, a young doctor who had been not only the first in his class, but #1 in the countrywide medical competitions. While he was passionate about medicine, he was forced to work for a trading company because there was no money in medicine at that time in Russia. At Moscow Medical School, the Soviet Union's chief medical school, he said there was a small specialty in preserving Lenin's body. Every 5 or 6 years the school turned out a graduate. It didn't need too many. The chosen few were selected to go down to Red Square and work on Lenin's remains. Maxim said that because an ear once fell off Lenin's head, visitors weren't allowed to talk or make a sound while viewing the remains. Visitors also weren't allowed to put their hands in their pockets, as they might be saboteurs. Today, people will periodically stand up in the Russian parliament and ask, "Why don't we bury this guy? This is absurd. He's not even our hero anymore." But his tomb was a big tourist attraction back then, so they couldn't afford to bury him. Actually, Maxim said Lenin had wanted to be buried. He'd left specific instructions to be buried in his mother's church cemetery or some such place. Then Stalin had come along and said, "No, we have to build him up as the hero of the revolution, so put him out there in the square." He had known that the people needed an icon, and he'd had nothing else. Stalin had wanted to be displayed there too, as if to show that he was another hero of the glorious revolution. Originally, he had been placed in Lenin's tomb, but one night Khrushchev had moved him out under cover of darkness. Maxim wanted to come to the United States to practice medicine. While there was nothing wrong with Soviet medicine as it was taught, doctors were forced to work the way local mechanics worked on cars. They made do. You might be a superb doctor, bursting with the knowledge of your specialty, but without CAT scans, penicillin, scalpels, and vaccines, how could you do your job? Moscow. The extremely inexpensive subways were nicer than New York's, each station with magnificent chandeliers and designed by a different architect. Stalin had built them, one of the few things he had done right, but we found little else over which to marvel. We still couldn't find Moscow's heart, its hub, nor any glitz or glamour. Even Red Square, the putative center of Moscow, was not bustling with Muscovites. The city was as dull, lackluster, and lifeless as a day-old pot of oatmeal. The huge government department store, called GUM, had few goods. Long queues were everywhere, the people in them as stolid, somber, and grim-faced as mourners at the funeral of a distant relative. We supposed they didn't have anything to smile about, or that they didn't want to be caught in public smiling, afraid somebody might ask, "Why are you happy? What's going on?" In private, people laughed and giggled with us, but in public, they were always grim. In Tokyo, New York, and Buenos Aires, you constantly run into a corner restaurant, a bistro, or an antique shop in which it's fun to poke around. There was none of that here. It didn't exist. In Moscow, you didn't stumble into some unique little shop, because it wasn't there. In the Soviet Union, the idea of a pet store was incomprehensible. In all of Moscow's vastness, there were maybe 3 cafes in which you could sit down and order a cup of coffee. The meanest cafe in many African or South American cities had a better menu than the best of these. In a Moscow kindergarten, we visited a former dissident, Tatiana, a trim, attractive woman who had been 4 years in a labor camp and another 4 in internal exile. "Our people are finally waking up," she said. "For 70 years we've been like these children here, waiting to be told by our parent, the party, what to do. We took no initiative, the way 5-year-olds expect their parents to do for them. It's hard to break out of that old mindset, but now we're all seeing we have to fend for ourselves. Hunger, scarcity, that's what's doing it. The Communist Party is dead." At a huge outdoor flea market near Moscow, German military uniforms, equipment, and medals from World War II were on sale, items abandoned by the defeated Nazi battalions hastily retreating to the fatherland. The Russians' former enemies were coming back from Berlin and Munich as tourists and buying at outrageous prices the equipment their fathers and grandfathers had abandoned 50 years earlier. We cranked up and left Moscow. We stopped at Borodino, the great battlefield. As it happened, we were there on the same day the battle had begun, August 26th. Poor Napoleon. He had won the battle here in 1812, but lost so many soldiers that his ultimate chances at victory had been doomed. As I read Napoleon's speech to his soldiers, in the wind, I heard the strains of the 1812 overture. "This is going to be a great battle," Napoleon told his men. "Someday you'll tell everybody with great pride you were present at the Battle of Borodino. Let's win this battle and race to Moscow so we'll all have warm apartments for the winter." Winter started here in September. Even this early we felt a sharp drop in the daytime temperatures from a few weeks before in July. I felt it on my neck. The air had a real chill to it, cool in the morning and cool in the afternoon. Those soldiers must have felt that chill too, and said to themselves, "Oh, Christ almighty, we don't want to be in this place for winter. We'd rather be back in Paris." But Napoleon said, "Don't worry, guys. We're all going to Moscow and get apartments." What he didn't know was that Moscow was going to burn the whole place down. "Okay," the Russian said. "You want it? Take it. But we just burned everything in sight. Take the whole city." So Napoleon lost the war. Would it really matter 300 years later who had won? I was certain that those scores of thousands of dead 20-year-olds on both sides would have preferred living out their lives rather than dying here in the great battle few now remembered and even fewer cared about. Some might say this particular battle had changed history. Does anybody really believe that France would have still controlled Russia nearly 200 years later, even if Napoleon had won this war? Tabitha and I were glad to be getting out, because winter was roaring in, the one I had worried so much about earlier back in China and Siberia. Finally, we reached Brest, our last city in the USSR. Properly speaking, Brest was Polish, but Stalin had wanted it and made it his after the Second World War, another example of a border drawn by a victorious army. People cry out these days for stable borders, but if this one is left unchanged, it will only endorse Stalin's madness in setting borders and his lust for more territory. We'd been almost 3 months in the Soviet Union on this leg, June through August. I was ecstatic at having made it and depressed at leaving. Ecstatic at knowing that most of our road problems could be easily solved in Europe, where we would find good roads, tires, spare parts, medicines, and money. I would be able to communicate with the world we'd left behind. I might even be able to get a real newspaper, which I hadn't seen since Tokyo. But I was depressed that this once-in-a-lifetime trip was over. This had been special, the panorama of a giant country in transition, The Soviet Union was coming out of a decades-old winter into a spring whose nature would be cruel. At the border, we found a gigantic queue. The Poles had already freed up their prices and their currency. Their money was fully convertible, and they had legitimate pricing. Of course, the Russian communists hadn't yet. So while there wasn't much to buy in Russia, all the Poles and Hungarians were piling in to buy whatever they could at absurdly low prices. In Poland, gas was $2 a gallon. In Russia, 12 cents. With everything else, cars, sheets, pots, pans, refrigerators, TVs, there was the same discrepancy. The Poles would take these low-priced goods back to their country and make a killing, selling Russian products for 20 to 100 times what they'd paid for them. Naturally, having made the same mistakes for 70 years, the Russians didn't just fix their currency or their prices. Instead, they put on export controls. The border guards had long lists of what you couldn't take out of the country. One guy had a bunch of sheets taken from him. We had souvenirs and Russian medals we were anxious about, but the guards didn't seem to think we could take out many refrigerators and sheets on our bikes, so they gave us only a cursory exam. Chapter 18. On to Ireland. Riding through the Polish countryside felt like pure freedom. We could go anywhere we wanted. The currency was convertible, so we didn't have to worry about black markets. We didn't have to worry about where to find food and gas. A year previous, the Poles had freed up everything. In Warsaw, on every block, vendors were selling Marlboros and Pepsi-Colas from kiosks. Back in Russia, there had occasionally been kiosks, but they sold mainly Russian cigarettes, and only after you'd been in line for 3 hours. In Polish kiosks, you could buy dresses, candy, whiskey, sodas, radios, batteries, flashlights, consumer goods of every stripe and variety, nearly all imported, which we hadn't seen since Tokyo. Few people in Warsaw had a real job, so they'd hit the streets, selling to hustle up a zloty. With completely convertible currency, the nimble ones could go to Berlin, buy goods, and bring them back to sell at home. After struggling through Turkey, China, and the Soviet Union over the past several months, we weren't in the mood for old-world charm. We stayed in the Warsaw Marriott, which was like heaven. All the hot water we wanted, well-cooked meals on white tablecloths, all the coffee we could drink, soft sheets, and the beds made for us, newspapers, faxes, the phones worked. I could pick up the instrument and talk to anybody I wanted. I even found a gym nearby. I'd forgotten it was possible for the world to work properly. At the BMW dealership in Berlin, the mechanics were agog at how much damage we'd done to the bikes. The bikes looked as if they'd been through a war, banged up, with jerry-rigged parts, fork seals gone, mud in every part, loose wiring, wobbly brakes, beat-up tires. They had to put a new crankcase in mine, and the head bearings were blown too. We explained that these were the wrong bikes for the trip we'd just taken, that we'd needed cross-country bikes, their GS model, which had higher wheels and fenders and stronger shock absorbers. As it happened, both of our bikes were under their original warranties. BMW had never assumed they were warranting such hard riding, but with a smile, the BMW executives said they would honor them. So they proceeded to rebuild the bikes, giving us thousands of dollars of repair work in what seemed to be a salute of our Trans-Siberian journey. We went to the world's largest motorcycle show in the Cologne-Essen area. I was struck by how extraordinarily modern, neat, clean, rich, and vibrant these cities were. I wouldn't have had the same impression on riding into Pittsburgh or Cleveland. These cities were dynamic and bustling. Everything was new, well-maintained, gleaming. And this was the Ruhr, Germany's Rust Belt, where the Allies had blown up all the factories they could, and through which their armies had marched. I'm often asked how we could have won the war by blowing up the German industrial heartland, and then find ourselves 50 years later on the short end of the stick. The guys who lost had had a good workforce to begin with, real craftsmen with real discipline. After the war, they hadn't been arrogant or sassy, but eager and grateful for a job. In America, everybody had been making a higher wage than those in Germany. Our currency had been worth something, whereas those guys had had nothing, no assets, no currency. Their workers had to work for a lot less and work a lot harder because they knew they had been beaten and they felt suppressed. They didn't have a choice. No pretensions there, absolutely none. During the Depression, our citizens had hoarded every penny, fearful of the future and putting off purchases. During World War II, even if they wanted to spend their savings, nothing was available on which to spend them. After the war, 15 years of pent-up demand exploded. No matter what you manufactured, you could sell it. To gear up for the demand, vice presidents of production were promoted to company president. Marketing people wouldn't be needed at the top until the 60s and 70s, when demand would become sluggish, as other countries brought their factories on stream. The reality of the late 40s for the United States was that the rest of the world had been destroyed, and our business managers could sell everything they could produce. Also, when you build a new factory, you use the most modern technology, whether in your manufacturing process or in the products you develop. Back in America, we said, "Look, this is how we built phonographs in 1939. We've gotten a little better. Here's the 1947 version. We haven't innovated for 8 years because we couldn't. Everything was going into the war effort. And why do we need to now?" The Germans weren't hidebound by their success. They had leapt forward in processes and products. People don't change their ways till they're forced to. Even if a visionary sits there and tells them what's going to happen, if it ain't broke, they'll do nothing. It takes real vision for a guy making a pile out of a 10-year-old phonograph design to revamp his product and cannibalize his own success with a cheaper product that has twice the features. It's not human nature, especially when currently you can sell all the machines you can make. However, it leaves you vulnerable to the guy who will produce such a product. Over the past 35 years, these have been the Germans, the Japanese, and only a few American manufacturers, such as Hewlett-Packard with its laser printers, who have made a vigorous policy of leapfrogging not only their competitors' products, but also their own. A people's mindset becomes wrapped up in the way things are. Even if people can believe something will happen a few years from now, they'll still say, "Well, that's in years, that ain't now." After World War II, Memphis, Birmingham, and Atlanta were approximately the same size and had approximately the same commercial chances. The business leaders of Memphis and Birmingham decided to rebuild and modernize their railway stations. Atlanta's leaders, however, decided to put their money into a new and large international airport. Atlanta became an international city, even able to attract the 1996 Olympic Games. Lacking reputations or infrastructures suitable for the big time, Birmingham and Memphis didn't make themselves into international laughingstocks by applying. However, I wondered if there wasn't a dangerous worm in the apple of this economic paradise, one that would gnaw at the center of Europe until it consumed the best part of this lovely fruit. The European Common Market was a trading group of 500 million people that had finally broken down the centuries-old economic walls that had divided them. Nearly everyone within its umbrella was benefiting from this large new open market. Now they could trade freely, just as citizens of Virginia could trade freely with those in California. This major economic development had huge ramifications for the world. The economic effect of integration, however, had been far less positive than had often been argued. At the same time these countries had been opening up their borders to each other, they had been erecting protectionist walls against the outside world. In the past 2 decades, these restrictive trade policies had protected sectors such as motor vehicles, consumer electronics, and office machinery. This would seem good for a while, but Europeans had been sowing the seeds of their own destruction. The common market's share of world products since 1970 had been concentrated in less sophisticated products. It could make wine efficiently, but not computers or electronics, since there was less pressure to innovate. In 5 to 15 years, I believed, they would pay a heavy price for this protectionism. Protectionism exists because local producers always clamor for it. French wheat farmers want to be protected from American wheat farmers. German steelmakers want to be protected from steel manufacturers in Korea. American auto workers want to be protected from their counterparts in Japan and Mexico. Japanese rice farmers want to be protected from those in America. In turn, American sugar growers want to be protected from Latin American producers. The list is endless, and highly organized and loud. In every country around the world, such groups contribute to political campaigns, hire lobbyists, and call for protection. After all, it sounds as patriotic as mom and apple pie to protect American auto workers' jobs, as well as those of northeastern shoemakers and southern textile workers. We all want that, don't we? The answer is no, we don't. Protectionism not only picks our pockets, it robs us as a society. We consumers, however, have no political leader active on our behalf. We have no lobbyists, and we aren't all that vocal. If Congress erects a wall to keep out foreign steel, the price of a tin can will go up, but perhaps only by 1/8 of a cent a year, scarcely enough to notice. The cost of a car might rise by 4 or 5% instead of 2 or 3% a year. Again, not enough to make you hire a lobbyist and hit the streets in protest. Over time, however, the effect is ruinous. Protected industries stagnate and don't innovate. Their products become shoddy and overpriced. American cars back in the 60s, without foreign competition, are a prime example. Once Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors had all the business, nature took its course and gave us poorly built cars at high prices. The world over, politicians face constant pressure from well-organized special interests clamoring for favors. The rest of us aren't organized well enough to clamor for our 1/8 of a cent off tin cans and cheaper Fords. Over the past couple of decades, the common market has tended to look backward and preserve itself from change rather than embrace it. It has used protection to avoid industrial restructuring, which has contributed to its falling behind the United States and Japan in producing high-tech goods. It has been doing okay relative to India and Africa, but not so well relative to Taiwan, southern China, and Korea. But an iron law of modern economics says that countries cannot protect themselves as the world changes by avoiding restructuring, by dodging the need to redeploy assets constantly into the most productive, most efficient facilities. And the world will change. Anybody who doubts that is brain dead. Not only will it change, but it will change with even more speed as the new decades arrive. The only question is how nations will meet these changes, whether they will innovate and compete or put their heads in the sand. Was America to produce 1970s shoddy cars forever, while the Japanese sold their well-designed, cheaper ones to the rest of the world? Were Americans never to buy Walkmans until an American company knocked off the design? A government's job must be to set up an environment that forces its culture, society, businesses, and institutions to adapt or perish. This sounds harsh, but the changes come almost unnoticeably. But it's a lot more gradual and less harsh than economic stagnation, high unemployment, and finally, catastrophic collapse, which is the result of long-term protectionism. Cases in point? The Soviet Union, Africa, Mexico, and every country in Latin America. Back in civilization as we know it, Tabitha again had doubts about continuing. Our original plan was to cross Europe, dive through Africa to the Cape, jump to Australia and New Zealand, fly to the tip of South America, and drive up to Alaska. Crossing China and Siberia had been feats enough for her. We bumped into a German, Felix, who had ridden a BMW motorcycle through Africa. He gave us information about the roads, visas, and problems. On the Theresienstrasse in Munich, we window shopped at Dares, a large store that outfitted overland journeys through Africa. Felix and Dares seemed to bring Tabitha around, sweep her up into the potential adventure. After all, here was Dares, a good-sized store set up specifically to outfit travelers crossing the Sahara and plowing through the jungle. We had certainly never seen a store that outfitted anybody to cross Siberia, and we had made it, hadn't we? Dares made it appear as if traveling through Africa was something a lot of people did. If there was an entire store devoted to it, how remote and difficult could it be? Africa. Had we really meant all that talk about going around the world? Africa by motorcycle, through the Sahara Desert and the mud swamps of Zaire. We'd heard of people, the lucky ones who came back, partially paralyzed or blind, others crippled or missing limbs, others mere skeletons with protruding eyes, discolored skin, and lips drawn away from their teeth. While Siberia was wild and unknown, at least there had been no war or epidemic. Africa, however, meant elephantiasis, lice, leprosy, typhoid, guinea worm, 2 kinds of hepatitis, yellow fever, yaws, tuberculosis, and of course malaria. Africa meant plague, brucellosis, beriberi, typhus, amoebas, cholera, smallpox, polio, 3 kinds of dysentery, giardia, river blindness from running water, and bilharzia from still water, plus the tsetse fly and sleeping sickness. If we got sick, much less very sick, at least one was inevitable. There would be few drugs and fewer hospitals. Books on Africa described travelers succumbing to sunstroke, dehydration, delirium, vomiting, prostration, and 2 kinds of diarrhea that lasted days on end. Other African travelers had to fight for their lives or were killed for no ever-discovered reason. We knew about the bribes and payoffs. Someone asked me my greatest traveling fear, and I said it was crossing the borders. Border guards have complete power over travelers, with no appeal granted. Even if our consular officials figured out which route we had taken, once we disappeared, few questions would ever be answered. Most African border crossings were too remote, too isolated, with little if any outside communication. Then there were the wars, tribal, civil, guerrilla, many undeclared, unreported, and spontaneous. In Africa, there is no such thing as a civilized war, where the participants are delighted to help 2 native travelers on some quixotic adventure. In these wars, everyone is desperately trying to survive and kill in a primitive struggle. More important still, I wasn't much of a prize other than for my bike, the traveling gear, and some money. But Tabitha was young, tall, blonde, and beautiful. Did I dare take her any farther? Where would we stay? Could we ever be safe? Animals in Siberia were one thing, but we didn't even know all the animal dangers that awaited us in Africa, and beyond there, South America. We knew nothing about the predatory habits of crocodiles, hippos, rhinos, puff adders, hyenas, mambas, boa constrictors, panthers, rabid bats, wild dogs, lions, tigers, cheetahs, leopards, elephants, gorillas, poisonous spiders, baboons, and pythons. All these and more were in the jungle. The leopards were exceptionally bold and clever, we'd heard. They would wait patiently in your tent for your return. Yet suppose all this was just the imagination of some soft American. Suppose all this was a bygone Africa. We still had to worry about gas, money, spare parts, roads, languages, food, water, who knew what. We did not even know what we did not know. Tabitha and I had driven our motorcycles from Ireland through China to Tokyo, then from Tokyo back across Siberia to Ireland, and now we paused in London. If we were going around the world, Africa was next, Tunis to the Cape. "I'm game to carry on," I said to Tabitha after a week of rest in London. "I've started around the world, gone halfway, and I've got to finish it right." For another few days we discussed it, and once again I wasn't sure she would come. Finally, one night at dinner she said, "Okay, I'll go, but promise me we'll take it easy. No more pushing." It wasn't a hard promise. The 20,000 miles of roads across China and Siberia had been rough, often unpaved, full of mud wallows and potholes. In Africa, they would be in even worse shape. There was so much to do, get vaccinations for yellow fever, cholera, tetanus, typhoid, polio, and hepatitis, round up the dozen visas necessary for African countries, buy tents, mosquito netting, and a water filtration system, buy spare parts for the motorcycles, gaskets, spark plugs, points, filters, fuses, and cables, find chlorine tablets, a folding shovel, a compass, antibiotics, salt tablets, and bandages, chapstick. Chapstick was essential for lips constantly dried by the wind and sun for hour after hour, day after day. Maps, we needed maps. The list seemed endless, the time short, if we were to avoid the winter. After hours, Tabitha and I wandered around the streets of London, happy to be with each other. I couldn't imagine anyone else in the world with whom I would rather have made this journey. To make it a true trip from the Atlantic to the Pacific and back again, we lit out for Ireland. For her 50th birthday present, we invited Tabitha's mother, Biffy, to come stay with us, hoping a visit would lessen her worries about her daughter. She flew over. She had Irish ancestry, but she'd never been here. A Wellesley graduate, she had been a beauty queen as a young lady, and now wanted a second career in nursing, after a first as a wife and mother. Biffy wept and pled with Tabitha not to go with me any farther, begging her daughter to come back to the States before she became a paraplegic. By now, Tabitha had made up her mind and was determined, but she tried to reassure her mother. In Dublin, we examined the Book of Kells, 340 pages handmade in 806 AD, and justly described as the most beautiful book in the world. Modern tourism had caught up with the book. In its honor, the library that housed it had special guides, souvenir shops, and tours. Back when I was a student, you simply went up to the library and looked at it. Now we had to go through a whole rigmarole to view it. I wanted to see the Nelson Pillar, a monument to the great British hero, which I remembered climbing as a student, but the IRA had blown it up. 150 years of history, and bam, gone. People always do these things. Destroy George III's statues in the States and Lenin's in the Soviet Union, as if they can change history by blowing up and pulling down. At Dunquin, we looked up Mrs. Campion, the postmistress, who howled with delight that we'd driven all the way to Tokyo, through China and Russia, and had come back to see her. More cups of tea, more postcards and displays of maps, lots of loud stories. Down on the southern coast, we found the motorcyclists, Kevin and Barry, who had helped us out the first time. We took Biffy with us on the back of my bike when they invited us to a motorcycle bar. This Connecticut matron in a leather motorcycle bar was perplexed by our entire trip, but had to admit she liked the wild freedom of riding motorcycles. She was also perplexed by her reaction to bike culture, a little stunned she should find the rough bikers charming and delightful. She rode with us for a week, back into England, unable to tear herself away, afraid it might be the last time she would see her daughter alive. In London, we visited the Algerian, Zimbabwean, and Nigerian embassies, seeking visas. Tabitha had made up her mind. She was ready to go. Next stop, North Africa, then right through the Sahara Desert, Central Africa, and South Africa to Cape Town. After all, we'd now been about a third of the way around the world. Why not go all the way?